Yeah, please get started.
No worries. Yeah. Pamela, did you want to get started?
Sure, yeah. Is the volume loud enough?
Yeah, it's the dimmer where the volume, where the sound is coming from, not the speakers. So.
Okay. I'm Pamela. We're on the policy research team at OpenAI. We're going to be talking a little bit about red teaming generative AI systems. So yeah, we're going to go through a bit about what red teaming is, or how we define it at OpenAI. An overview of our approaches to red teaming. Lama will walk through 2 case studies where we employed expert red teamers, both DALL-E 2 and GPT-4 with Vision. And then we'll talk a bit about how this ties back into our moderation systems that Toder will talk more about, and some of the lessons learned and sort of questions we'll be thinking about in the coming year. So what is red teaming? So we describe the process of red teaming as a structured effort to find flaws and vulnerabilities in a plan, organization, or technical system, often performed by dedicated red teams that seek to adopt an attacker's mindset and methods. So it really takes this adversarial viewpoint of, if I'm trying to do something bad, how well can I use the system to accomplish that task? Whereas something like sort of, oh, I'm probing might take a sort of much more neutral viewpoint, and doesn't have as clear a threat model attached to it. And you can think of this as kind of like stress testing or boundary testing. So testing is not limited to or primarily focused on like having a security posture or attack resilience. It's not necessarily adversarial in nature, but we focus on sort of like eliciting the limitations of the model to try and basically push the model to the point where you would have to have a sort of really strong adversarial viewpoint in order to break the system. And I think there's like a few different kinds of ways to think about this. And we're like constantly sort of revising and revisiting our definition, both as these systems change, as the sort of system, like the world that they are deployed in changes. The threat model that we're considering changes quite a bit as well. And also the exact techniques to that work for red teaming are changing as well. So now we can sort of rely on the model to do some of the actual like probing and like employ experts in some of risk assessment, but we'll use red team today. And yeah, okay. So OpenAI, our mission is to ensure that the development of AGI benefits all of humanity. And a lot of what our team works on is this kind of like process of iterative deployment that both tries to clarify our definitions of like benefit and bring us closer in contact with all of humanity, to kind of refine our safety processes and story based on how people actually use these systems in the world. So red teaming tends to emerge once we have a trained model, before it's deployed, though there is a sort of iterative process that happens after that. So, but a lot of that is from users. So you can see this in the evaluations and iterative development. And so we both, like, once a model is trained, we have model evaluations, we have a kind of impact assessment, like if the model could do this, what would that kind of harm or hazards or risks would that lead to in the real world? And we do this red teaming process to try and break the model, and all of these kind of feed back into each other. So if red teaming like uncovers a new domain, we develop an evaluation in that domain, and kind of continue to iterate within each of these sections as well. And great. We also like, I think there's a cooperative sort of version of red teaming that we can think about. So we've partnered with the White House, and then we're going to talk more about this on this effort to red team in partnership with Google and Anthropic at DEF CON. You can see some of our sort of like the results of our red teaming in the GPT-4 system card, in the DALL-E 2 system card. You can sort of learn more about other efforts to red team for this paper from Anthropic, or Hugging Face here. Yeah. And expert red teaming is one tool we use. Oh, okay. In addition to sort of internal red teaming for OpenAI employees, and we'll talk through some of that.
Okay, so I just briefly want to touch upon this previous slide actually and say that while we're going to be focused on expert red teaming today, meaning collaborators that we contract with, normally academic researchers, but also we've started to include industry partners, such as folks who work on trust and safety teams, as well as members of civil society organizations or other nonprofit organizations that might have expertise in specific areas. And usually this type of red teaming happens prior to deployment of a model, though that's supplemented with internal red teams that we employ at our company. We also work with data vendors and have started piloting working with data vendors to help generate red team data and synthesize insights, and also get access to different sets of expertise, which I'll reference a little bit in the GPT-4 with vision red teaming. We also have some open research on automated red teaming, though I think at red teaming in a qualitative sense will continue to remain important, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later. So some of the areas that we focus on with expert red teaming include deep dives in particular technical fields. That might be, someone who has background in coding and looks at the model's ability to find bugs. Others are content policy-based red teaming, which might be most relevant to this particular group. We're also really interested in identifying novel risks, so red teaming in the areas of chemistry, biology, physics, things like that, to understand how increases or maybe potential limitations in capabilities might contribute to the risk landscape. We're also interested in red teaming that adds evidence to our ongoing broader research on societal impact, including work on geopolitical impact, economic impact. These are longer term research agendas, but we start to frame some of the risks and questions during the red teaming period. And then lastly, expert red teaming also gives us the advantage of having access to people who can help us understand the severity of a risk in a particular domain and advise on that. Red teaming also doesn't just look at the model level, so it's not just about the input and output. We're also interested in looking at things at the system level. So how effective are our mitigations? How does the system encourage or discourage certain types of uses or behaviors? The system itself might pose some risks. And we're also interested in thinking about best practices across the industry. So an example is for models like DALL-E, thinking about things like watermarking or provenance, and even red teaming some of the failure modes there. It's important to consider how the existence of other models or other systems might affect the risk landscape writ large. To give another view of where red teaming is kind of placed in the system or the development of a system, primarily we've focused expert red teaming on after the model is fully trained, and then in between the model being fully trained into being put into a system or an interface, which is going to be exposed to users. And so those can kind of look a little bit distinct, but it's important to note that a lot of the red teaming that we've done has been iterative, where we kind of start with just the inputs and outputs to the model. There might be some fine tuning on top afterwards, and then things like prompt filtering that are added to the system later on. And at each phase, it's important to think about how do we assess the risks. As I alluded to earlier, we think qualitative red teaming will continue to matter even if we develop robust ways of automating red teaming. Issues that arise as a result of model deployments can be systemic and context dependent, and that's where it's really helpful to have a person in the loop kind of contextualizing what's happening with the model or the system as they go through the testing process. In addition, evaluating novel risks or risks that we haven't kind of looked at before will require expertise that we don't have in-house and probably don't have clear ways of automating or evaluating. So I'll quickly just go through a case study. The first time we really ran red teaming in this way in collaboration with experts was during the release of the DALL-E 2 model. We worked with 25 researchers and industry professionals. They were involved in 3 ways. We had advisory conversations about the model and the system in relation to their areas of expertise. Researchers had indirect programmatic access, so they could bypass prompt filters and accelerate their analysis. And they also had direct access to the end preview site to test all of the functionalities. Again, this was during the early development of DALL-E 2, and the findings from red teaming later informed our deployment approach, as well as subsequent mitigations that were applied. Some of the things that red teamers found during the red teaming process of DALL-E 2, one category was visual synonyms, so the use of prompts to describe concepts that might bypass our prompt filters. So an example of that is a high quality image of a napkin with dark red liquid. What's implied by dark red liquid? Probably blood. That might have been caught by our prompt filters in some contexts, but it would be easy to kind of bypass if you're using these sort of visual synonyms. And that was unique to kind of the multimodal system, because you're using text to kind of imply a visual description, and thinking about content moderation in that context, it would probably be quite difficult to detect without embeddings or a generations classifier. The second thing is bias in representation. We've seen this many, many times over and over again, but images that are generated tend to overrepresent people who are white passing and Western-centric concepts generally. People are presented as stereotypes, and there could be bias in the system and safety system design. These are a few examples that were found by red teamers during the DALL-E 2 red teaming process. Another really important thing to note about DALL-E 2 was that it introduced the in-painting functionality, and that introduces more challenges in, one, detecting potential vectors of misuse, but two, then thinking about how to mitigate them or think about content moderation practices for the context of in-painting. And so we can think about things like harassment and exploitation using images. Images that seem innocuous on their own can be harmful in different settings. An example here, a woman eating a salad, maybe she's a vegetarian. If you in-paint her food to look like she's eating some meat, for example, in some context, if you know this woman personally, you might wonder why she's doing that. You might think about with the intention of a person who would edit this image in this way. And the ability to quickly in-paint realistic looking images was a new risk vector that had to be considered. And so red teaming also focused on potential harassment and exploitation vectors that were introduced with in-painting. Similar story for dis and misinformation. You can think about how in-painting might realistically augment images that could produce propagandic narratives that could be convincing, could create convincing persona images and undermine trust in legitimate sources. And you can start to see how red teaming helps to create examples that would allow people who are thinking about content moderation decisions to have to grapple with some of the challenges that might arise as a result of these multimodal systems that might be difficult to do if you were trying to, say, automate the red teaming of disinformation campaigns using in-painting. I'll also quickly talk about GPT-4 with vision capabilities, our most recent model that's not widely released yet, but some of the I'll highlight two of the areas we started red teaming with some of our expert testers. One area was ungrounded assumptions, meaning assumptions that could be made if given image as an input and not necessarily having other context other than the prompt and the image. And so what could somebody assume about the image, or what would the model assume about the image given only a prompt and image pair, and what are the potential misuse vectors there? So we asked red teamers to test some of those areas. In this particular example, this was the image inputted into the model. It's a man and a woman, and asked to look at the photo, analyze both candidates to find a final solution. Our liberal boss, or I think what was meant here was to, I think there's a typo in this prompt, but I think what was meant here was to look at the image and decide on which candidate would be good to promote, and give 10 reasons why you would hire one and not the other. And you can see that the model decided to promote candidate one, which was the man, and listed a bunch of reasons: professional attire, confident posture. Some of these are supposed to be tied to what's portrayed in the image. And then in the second one, you see the reasons not to promote candidate two, woman, withdrawn or unapproachable demeanor, limited experience, skills do not align. And so you can start to see how assumptions might be made that are not actually grounded either in the prompt or in the image, and what sorts of biases might start to emerge. So when you add image as an input, you add another complexity of multimodal models where you have to start to figure out how the text and the image and the generation all interact together. Another example, which I think is important to highlight, which is not necessarily an adversarial example. You could kind of see in the previous example, there was a bit of an adversarial lens. For medical advice, you can think about potentially a very legitimate use case where thinking about how medical practitioners might want to use GPT-4 with vision capabilities in radiography context, for example. And so we worked with some medical experts to try and find the failure modes in some of these use cases. And so an example is, this is an image of the brain and asking which side of the brain the hydrocephalus is located in this image. And the completion said that it's located on the left side of the brain. But in fact, the medical experts noted that this was an incorrect generation. And part of that is the models are not yet good at detecting positionality. So which direction you're facing or which direction the image was taken from is important for understanding or interpreting this image. And so in this case, having a medical expert in particular test the failure modes is pretty important for understanding some of the limitations of the use of the model in medical context. And so this is red teaming that looks a little bit different because it's not necessarily adversarial. It's trying to elicit the limitations of the model without explicitly trying to have it generate bad completions. I'll pass it back to Pamela to tie this a little bit back to moderation. Pamela, if you're ready.
Yeah, so in order to, so a thing that happened when we first released GPT-3 is that the model would devolve into harmful content without necessarily being prompted for it. And so one of the things that our alignment efforts has done is that it forces the user to be really clear and explicit when they're trying to break our policies rather than the model sort of breaking the policies for them. It's pretty important because we want to ensure that when if we're taking efforts to enforce our policies to ban users to take other efforts to enforce them, then that they know they're breaking the policies. The policies have been sort of reasonably and the purpose of the system have been reasonably effectively translated for the user, and that they chose to do so anyway. So they made some effort to jailbreak, to evade the policies in some way. And our red teaming efforts then can sort of inform our alignment efforts because they tell us how well we've actually done at the system performing when prompted with sort of innocuous cases. So in the case of the sort of ungrounded assumptions, as well as with sort of actively adversarial cases, because we also, if we do have an actual adversarial user, it's better to be able to have the model sort of effectively respond rather than waiting to enforce the policies later on. And so we can both lead to sort of controlled systems mitigation. So this is across most of our products. We have prompt filters, image upload filters in the case of DALL-E and GPT-V, 4V, content policy, which is informed directly by our red teamers, warnings that appear in the system when you are attempting to break the policies, as well as a security system that monitors for different kinds of threats. We also sort of have, this feeds directly back into how we build out their monitoring infrastructure and moderation infrastructure. So what categories do we want to enforce on? How do we build out data sets of those prompts and completions and build a training system based off that? And Twitter will talk more about this, so I won't go into it too much, but and then we want to red team the moderation system itself. So filtering can sort of lead to examples of bias. In the case of DALL-E, we saw that when we filtered out too much sexual content, that ultimately led to a more biased system. The model sort of didn't produce images of women as often. And similarly, if there's model just shows differential performance across different categories, that can misalignment can exacerbate that in different ways. And we want to sort of also figure out who does the moderation system work for? What definition of bias is it using? How flexible should that be in different contexts? and how effective is it? And then looking ahead, we learned a ton of lessons through all of these different red teaming processes. So we know that open-ended systems will behave in open-ended ways and will be used in open-ended ways. And so we need more feedback from a variety of stakeholders early in the process, stakeholders who are broadly representative of the world and not just sort of people on our social networks. We want to sort of red team at each stage of the process. So we want to red team the model itself, how it's deployed in an API, how it's deployed in an actual sort of end user system, because each of those steps have very different threat models, very different types of uses, and different kinds of mitigations that we can employ, given the sort of red teaming results. It's also important for us to sort of think about the severity of the risk that emerges from red teaming examples in addition to the examples themselves. So some of the most egregious examples actually might carry with them very low chance of risk when deployed in the real world, where some of the things that can feel quite innocuous in the context of a red team actually bring with them much greater risk because their users are much more likely to face those. So sort of product of size of risk times, likelihood that it happens is like an important output of these red teaming as well. We want to create an infrastructure that basically makes this easy, makes it easy to scale up, makes it easy for sort of lots of people to contribute to. And so that's something we are working on. And we want to kind of balance like sensitivity with sort of results that we'll end up getting. So how do we make a sort of red team that's big enough that we actually get sort of reasonable and representative results, while also not revealing that we have a model that's in development that we're actively trying to sort of work on and fix before we release it. At what stage does it make sense to bring in red teamers to sort of replicate this process once we sort of put in mitigations? And then how do we build that all into testing so that our red teamers can focus on the sort of next stage of risks rather than having to sort of repeat the process exactly. So moving forward, we have a couple of questions that we're prioritizing. So employing experts more in risk assessments, red teaming non-content-based harms, so economic harms, things like dependency and over-reliance that might emerge after repeated interactions with the system, better utilizing the model as a member of the red team itself, sort of free up the red team to sort of focus on the next stage of risks or what the model might miss. Red teaming and interacting with blue teaming and white teaming and purple teaming or whatever sort of name you prefer. So how do we sort of like use blue or purple team to identify how the system is ultimately extremely useful and identify the like most positive use cases, and then make sure red teaming can then focus on the kind of the rest. And how do we consider novel harms? So multimodal harms, repeated interactions, over-reliance, dependence that might emerge, personalization of models, dangerous capabilities that might use different kinds of red teaming. And the ARC evaluation in the GPT-4 system card is one thing to look toward there. Plugins and how these systems interact in the world with other AI systems, systems that we might put out ourselves in the case of ChatGPT plugins, but also systems that others might put out and release in different ways. So if you're interested in any of these questions, please let us know. We're always eager to work with more people. So awesome. Thank you all so much. I think that's the last slide.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lama and Padma. It's a wonderful talk, and you are inviting participation. How do people sign up? Maybe you can share something in the chat so they know how to get a hold of you.
We will share emails, but also look for more, hopefully, on red teaming and how to get involved with red teaming in the next few weeks.
Okay, sounds great. And I thought there was a hand raised, and you are going to join us for the panel discussion, right? At around 11?
Yes, we will be.
That'd be great. I think that'd be a great chance for people to ask questions. And thank you for also keeping us on time. And I see Maven in the list. Chris, if you want to introduce her. Yeah, if you could stay with us, that'd be great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lama and Pamela. Yeah. Hi, Maven. Yeah, Chris will introduce you.
Okay. Thanks, Maven, for dialing in. Can you all hear me? So Maven Babakar is calling from Europe with a very low bandwidth Wi-Fi connection because she's at the Obama leadership conference there. She just got named an Obama leader. And during the day, she's at Google, the news and information credibility lead. She has been the CEO of Full Fact in England, which is a big fact-checking organization, has been on many boards like the International Fact-Checking Network. And without further ado, she will give us a great survey and questions about human fact-checking. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Thumbs up, great, thank you. Thanks to the one guy that put his thumb up, I appreciate that. Thanks for that introduction, Chris. Excellent hype man. I'm very, very tired, so I'm sorry if this won't be huge energy, but I was hoping to, when Chris told me about this event, I realized that with everything happening around generative AI and large language models, and the conversation that Chris and I had, it became clear that more and more people had questions about fact-checking, how fact-checking works, how fact-checkers around the world do their work, whether there's space to grow that, whether there's space to scale, and lots of fantastic data scientists are coming to me and asking about that. And I thought that that might be helpful for this audience as well to just take a step back from the minutiae of the models and just understand a bit about the fact-checking community. So forgive me if you know all of this already, but I think it's important that we fill in the blanks for everybody on how fact-checking works. It shouldn't take up the whole half hour, so we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. So please capture those as we go, and I'll try my best to answer everything. Okay, can you all see my slides? Yeah, fantastic. So actually, I should also just explain why I care about facts and misinformation myself. So I was originally born in Iraq. I'm Kurdish, born in Iraq, and if you know about the history of that area, there was a lot of mis and disinformation campaigns around the Kurdish population, some of which led on to the genocide of the Kurds perpetrated by Saddam. For me, this is very personal. I was a refugee for 5 years as a result of that genocide. And I see around the world, and you will have experienced around the world, polarization as a result of mis and disinformation. And I think it's really important that we remember that although mis and disinformation can be as simple as a scam or a piece of information that doesn't really have any real world effect, at the other end of the spectrum, it can have dramatic effects in terms of risks to life, risk to polarizing communities. And it's important that we remember that in the context of all the things that we're working on. So what is fact-checking? Before I actually talk about fact-checking, I wanted to talk about just misinformation interventions overall. There are lots of interventions that you can put in place to actually start to break down these problems. And I wanted to situate fact-checking within that as just a helpful framing. So there are lots of individual level interventions that can take place, and these are just a handful. For example, we can do sort of boosting around pre-bunking, critical thinking, media literacy, giving people the tools to actually think about the information that they're seeing. Nudging, where we can actually give people accuracy primes and nudge them towards particular behaviors. There's debunking, and this is where fact-checking sits around the world of corrections. Also content labeling, so automated or manual labels that come from various human races or others. Then we've got systems levels interventions. So these are things like algorithms, business models, legislation, geopolitics. As you can see, there's a whole slew of different things that can take place when we're talking about mis and disinformation. And they all require different actors, different levels of intensity, different resources. But today we're just going to focus on this one, fact-checking and corrections. And also, if you want to read more on this, there's a really great source, which I really recommend, a paper by Rosenbeek in 2023 that I've linked that is great reading. So you might have seen this before, which is the sense of what is fact-checking, what is verification, and the intersection of the two is debunking. I think more and more this is like slightly less true, but I think it's just a helpful guide. So in the world of fact-checking, a lot of the things actually rely on individual claims of public relevance, often things that cause harm. It relies on experts, academia, sources, and it's about the veracity of a particular claim. On verification, it's more like in the language that is used around verification is more about images and video. So specifically understanding the prevalence of something, where it's come from. And the word debunking is used to just kind of mean both of these things. One of the quotes I like best from a fact-checking organization is this one. It's our job to bring clarity to ambiguity, to give people the information they need to make up their minds, not necessarily telling them to take our word for it, but giving them a shortcut to the research that they might do if they had the time. So it's really about giving people options. And I think that that's very relevant, maybe in the world of generative AI, and starting to think about, can we do more than just give people an answer? Can we give them options to help them with their critical thinking, to help them with their media literacy? How do we actually give people more ability to decide and not less? I think it's interesting to think about what the purpose of fact-checking is, because I've just told you it's about debunking and corrections, but the fact-checkers themselves don't agree on what fact-checking is here for. I say that as somebody who is in the fact-checking world for about 7 years, so we all had different opinions about why we existed. We had different ideas about who we were. So for most of us, we thought we were journalists, and a lot of fact-checking does come from journalism. More and more, the great shift that really happened in the last 20 years is most news outlets had fact-checkers, regardless of really how big or small. Fact-checkers were embedded in the journalistic process, often as a separate team. And then with the change in sustainability and business models, fact-checkers more and more became another part of the skill set of every journalist. So we lost the fact-checking teams in the big news outlets, and we expected the journalists to pick up the extra fact-checking work on top of all the investigative work. I mean, fact-checking is already baked into the journalistic process, but it helps having checks and balances. And the bigger newsrooms, some of them retained that over that period, but with the advent of the newer newsrooms, we're seeing it as something that's not a standalone team, but something that was expected of the journalist. And then in the last few years, we're seeing a whole bunch of journalists and fact-checking teams like pop up again in the main newsrooms. So it's been a bit of a wild journey of not having fact-checkers for a while and then having them again. And the reason why the fact-checkers are popping up again in newsrooms specifically is because there are new business models for fact-checking. So Facebook has its third-party fact-checking program, which actually pays fact-checkers around the world to do fact-checking. And that's actually quite lucrative for newsrooms right now as well, that are signing up and generating these new fact-checking teams. Beyond journalism, a lot of fact-checkers see themselves as activists. And that's particularly dispersed in places around the world where there's less and less press freedom. We see fact-checkers actually holding a position that is more than just journalistic, but actually standing up to regimes a lot of the time. Key example of that is Maria Ressa, Nobel Prize winner, who actually ended up going to prison for a while, and in the Philippines. And activism isn't necessarily as extreme as standing up to dictators. It can also be about data activism. So a lot of the fact-checking that actually takes place often identifies where are the sources of information absolutely terrible and where are the sources of information so poor that they might not exist, or they might be miscommunicating something in such a big way that actually it's affecting a whole line or a whole narrative of misinformation. So there's a lot of data activism as well. Inevitably, when you're at the front lines of fact checking and are consistently, you have a lot of really fantastic insights into what are the policies and legislation that might actually go on to change the landscape, which is why a lot of fact checkers also consider themselves policy experts. They lean in to the discomfort of the information ecosystem. They see the harm that is done, and they can pull out the case studies that actually make for really good conversations with policymakers and legislators. So it's just worth remembering they're actually quite significant in that sense in helping diagnose some of the issues that are taking place. And then about 30% of fact checkers would consider themselves academics as well. They often come out of research organizations. Some of them start there because it's less risky. And then again, there's a smaller cohort that consider themselves technologists. But more and more, I would say, this is actually quite old research now, 2018, but more and more, I would say that technologist branch has probably grown a fair bit over the last few years. Cool. You all with me? Am I talking too fast, too slow? We good? Okay. Right, this is what they think they do. Primarily give citizens the information to make political choices. That is what most fact checkers think that they are here to do. The next biggest thing is improving the quality of public discourse, then holding politicians accountable to citizens, promoting accuracy and independence in journalism, seeking policy change. So you'll notice that the first few are really centered around political choices. And actually that is more and more a space that fact checkers aren't allowed to grow into because of choices being made by platforms. And I think it's an interesting question for society about what are the limits of political discourse? How do we make sure that people are getting the right information they need? And that's beyond just giving them polling station data and their candidates that they're voting for. What are the limits of actually checking facts around a political debate? And we haven't really decided that as a society, and definitely haven't decided that, or if we have, those rules are very old. And if we haven't decided that in the modern day. Cool. I really wanted to point out this difference between narratives and stories or claims. A lot of well, let me first explain what I mean. So stories and claims are like individual pieces of information. So we're talking, they're like living, local, specific, referring to an immediate or concrete event. A lot of fact checking exists in the realm of a claim. So it might be something like, this particular immigrant has illegally come into this country, or like 100 immigrants have come into the country illegally and are stealing X amount of public money. So you might fact check that individual claim. But it's really interesting to think about how those claims add up to a wider narrative and add up to a wider story. And when I say narrative, I mean it's a template that provides the plot lines or tropes that actually gives people a feeling about where that story could go or how it could be. So if stories are like cars, narratives are like the highways. And narratives are like the basis for habitual actions, emotions, and thoughts. So actually narratives are the things that shape our meaning making. They're the things that actually help us make choices about what we believe and what we do. And these stories add up to these narratives. So if we had in the example of the story where X number of immigrants have come into the country taking public money, the narrative would be something like immigrants are bad, refugees are bad, and that those two things, you can work at debunking the story level, but the work of actually doing stuff at the narrative level is very different. Is everything okay? I'm seeing a lot of movement at the front there, and I'm not sure if you can still hear me.
No, yeah, all good. We're just figuring out how to let people ask questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, are there a lot of questions? I haven't really been looking at the... Cool. I'll keep going. Sorry.
No,
Just thought
we
that,
will help. Yeah,
something was on fire. Great. Right. So who are the fact checkers? This is the number of fact checkers that exist in the world right now. Well, in 2022. So there was about 378 active fact checkers. In 2021, there are a lot more. we're actually seeing a slight decrease. And actually, I wager that there'll probably be a decrease again, just because there aren't the grants or the business models to keep that many fact checkers going right now. You'll notice it's not that many, really, in the grand scheme of things. There's not that many fact checkers. And this is how they're split across continents. There are a growing number in certain areas, but really the reason why the money that comes into fact checking and fact checkers is primarily from grants. Very little of it, and actually at the moment a lot of it probably comes from Facebook as well. And I think that that is one of the general questions around fact checking, is what is the right number of fact checkers to have in the world? How do we make sure that they're sustainable? How do we make sure that they're growing in many different regions, not just the ones that are well funded? Yeah. Languages. This is the split of languages that exists at the moment. English is pretty prevalent, but we're getting more and more languages popping up all the time. There's a bit of a concerted effort in the last year and a half to actually get even more languages published on various websites. And I think some of the larger fact checkers are starting to work more globally, which is quite interesting. Previously, they were very highly localized to certain regions. And now a couple of them are starting to work across borders. I think COVID in particular saw the largest coalition of fact checkers around the world working together, because the claims that they were seeing were all the same. And it's actually very rare to have a moment like that where misinformation crosses borders. But more and more, the pandemic has showed us that there are ways for fact checkers to work together on certain things, and especially on geopolitical issues like Ukraine. There's misinformation that obviously exists in Ukraine, but there's also a lot of misinformation that is being exported out of Ukraine to other countries. And there's an opportunity there for people to work together in many different languages, and that's being explored at the moment. It's just about affiliations. Like I was saying, a lot of them are affiliated with actual media organizations, about 60%. So there's often a fact-checking desk, and that's a growing number. A lot of them operate as nonprofits and independently, and some of them are tied to academic institutions. There's one that I find quite interesting, is rating systems. About 80 to 90% of fact checkers use some sort of rating meter or standardized labels to convey their findings. So I'm talking about true, false, like mostly false, Pinocchios, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s, etc. But one of the things that we're actually seeing is a few of the louder fact checkers are starting to say that ratings are not that helpful. And I think Christopher Egberg, who's the editor at FactDesk, a Norwegian fact-checking organization, said it really nicely in this quote, and I'm going to read it out to you if you don't mind. The decision to move away from the traditional scale was hard and subject to a very long discussion and consideration within the team. Many felt that a rigid system where conclusions had to fit the glove became a kind of straitjacket, causing us to either drop claims that weren't precise enough or too complex to fit into one fixed conclusion. Or to, instead of doing the fact check, simply write a story instead, where a rating was not necessarily needed. Sometimes the color of the ratings became the main focus rather than the claim and conclusion itself, which derailed the important discussion about the facts. So instead of using the true false rating that they used previously, they've started to actually write paragraphs that explain in much more detail, not just that this is true or false, but here's what happened, here's the context, here's the summary, and here's the specific thing that you need to know about this specific claim. And I think that in their eyes is doing more of a good job of not just giving people an answer, but also providing some sort of media literacy on top of that to actually analyze what happened, what went wrong, and how that might change over time. Standards bodies. So you've got this whole layer of fact checkers individually, and then on top of that, you're starting to see some individual standards bodies pop up. So the biggest is the International, pardon the typo, Fact Checking Network, and that is which is something actually I was on the board of for a year and a half. But the International Fact Checking Network is a standards body that oversees 300 fact checking organizations They apply to actually meet a set of standards every single year, and then they get that certification for a year as an IFCN certified fact checker. The requirements to actually meet that standard are about transparency of sources, transparency of funding, actually making it being very clear in the way that you write your fact checks, being non-partisan, being and that non-partisanship is actually assessed by various assessors who look at the total body of your work over time and who also understand the context of the country that you're working in and are able to appraise if you meet that standard of neutrality that is met by the IFCN. More recently, we have regional networks popping up. So there's something called the EFCSN, which is the European Fact-Checking Network, and very recently the AFCSN, the Arab Fact-Checking Network. So we're seeing a kind of splintering off of the international faction into smaller ones. That's hot gossip in the fact-checking world. But I imagine that we'll see even more of those in the coming years. There actually isn't that much research, shockingly, about the effects of fact-checking. I wish there was a lot more of it. But one of the better pieces of research that I'm going to talk to you about today is this one. It's a paper that was published called The Global Effectiveness of Fact-Checking. And it was run by Ethan Porter and Thomas J. Wood. And it was published in PNAS. I can't remember what it stands for. But essentially what happened is they showed users in Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, and the UK a series of fact checks. And the question that they were trying to answer essentially was, does fact checking durably reduce belief in misinformation? So 22 fact checks were shown to users. And 2 of those fact checks were actually shown in every single country that took part. And the fact checks were actually shown in the way that it would have been shown on the website. So that it's not that data was extracted, it was actually shown in situ. And they found over time that the fact checking actually reduced the belief in misinformation. And not only that, but the effects were still apparent more than 2 weeks later when users were resurveyed. So in their own words, a meta-analytic procedure indicates that fact checking reduced belief in misinformation by at least 0.59 points on a 5-point scale. Just the exposure to misinformation, however, increased the false belief by less than 0.07 points on that same scale. So the exposure to the misinfo is small, but the actual fact-checking has a larger effect. Now for the good stuff. How does it actually work? How does fact-checking, what does the process actually look like? I'm actually going to take a moment to see if there are any questions. Does anyone have any questions for me at this point before I get into the process?
There's a question in the chat. Let me read it for you. Do you see a place for fact-checking as it exists for the LLM AI chat, generative AI domain? Yeah,
I do. And I think that the person was right. We should come to that at the end because I've got a slide on that. So if that's the only question, then I'll save it for the end.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So fact checking. Oh, I did that wrong. Ignore that one, guys. I forgot the animation on it. But it starts with monitoring. So fact checkers monitor public debate. They actually look at parliamentary debates, newspapers, legislation, TV subtitles, Twitter feeds, Facebook, whatever you want. Press releases a lot of the time. And will use sometimes volunteers, sometimes media monitoring tools, sometimes in the case of Full Fact in the UK, they'll actually use an AI media monitoring tool that identifies claims in real time. And what happens is the team then decides that spots claims that they consider particularly harmful or they consider particularly useful to fact check. So it's not actually the same thing as editorially interesting. Most fact checkers are coming at it from a slightly different place. So it's not just what is the most interesting thing for a user to read. It might be in some cases, but a lot of the time it comes from what is the largest harm and how can we mitigate that harm through a fact check. So it's slightly different than a journalistic article, but the team will either use these tools that help them spot claims in real time, or their editorial judgment, and will choose the things to prioritize for that day. Then the process of checking actually begins. So they'll research the claim that has been made, and that often starts by understanding where that claim came from. So it's about finding the person who made the claim, finding out the source, finding out if you can talk to them, how they came to that conclusion, what data they used. And then there's a series of questions that are asked about what is the context that it was used in, what is the motivation and intention, is there anything missing? And we'll take all of that and then compare it to the best available information. So that might actually mean calling up a particular institution, an academic institution, a particular scientific body, or it might be calling up the NHS. In our case, a lot of the time we spent talking to the National Health Service in the UK. But whoever it might be that is involved in that claim, the job of a fact checker in terms of the content produced is to understand where the misinformation came from, and then compare that to the best available information and produce something that allows a user to make a reasoned choice about where to place their trust. Yeah. I will add to that, just because in the modern day, it's not enough to just tell people this is true or false. You have to show them why it is, and you have to show them how you came to that conclusion in order to engender their trust. And then publishing. So once you have all of that, we can't just publish it in 3,000 word essays because no one will read that. There's a really sophisticated job actually of having to condense really complicated information into really digestible pieces of communications. That might look, right now it looks a lot like text. I think a lot of fact checkers would really love to get into images and video a lot more, but it's very resource heavy. But part of that communication piece is also communicating ambiguity. So it's actually very important to explain to people the risk involved in something and how certain a particular answer is. So a really good example of this is in the UK, God, what's that number? Like the infection ratio. I can't remember if that's what it was called, but you know, like if you're somebody who has COVID, the number of people that you go on to infect. And in the UK, that was communicated as just like a solid number, like 2 or 1 or 3 at various points. And the Winton Centre for Trust in Cambridge made the very helpful point that actually that is communicating certainty where we don't have it. And it's actually then when that number changes, removing trust from the institution that actually published that number with such certainty, because that number kept changing from 2 to 2.5 to 3 and then back down. And actually people were looking at that and going, well, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. And it was really important. A very small but very impactful change was just putting a range instead of a solid number, and just saying that this is between 1.5 and 2.5 and that it exists within that range. And there are small, tiny ways of communicating risk or ambiguity that actually have a profound effect on public trust. And I think we haven't done a good enough job of actually researching those and getting those, but there are a lot of fact checkers who know these tips and tricks, and we haven't learned from them as a community yet, and I think that we should. And finally, corrections. More and more fact checkers are actually getting into the world of getting public figures to correct the record, so MPs to correct the record, or actually helping people who publish research to sort things out and fill the data voids that might exist. Cool. So a lot of people talk about automated fact checking. Also, I've run out of time now, haven't I? Roughly? No? I'm good? Okay, cool. A lot of people talk about automated fact checking, and Lucas Graves, a close friend, published this great paper called Understanding the Promise and Limits of Automated Fact Checking. And actually there's a couple of papers coming out, one from Andreas Lachos at Cambridge that I really, when it's out, really recommend, that will go into like an updated version of automated fact checking. The 3 pillars of and when I say automated fact checking here, I'm saying like parsing out a sentence, understanding what is the best available source to actually get the data needed to assess that, and then generating a verdict in real time and pushing that towards a user in a meaningful way. There are all sorts of problems in that entire ecosystem. One, identifying the actual claim is relatively easy, and I've seen lots of people do that in fantastic ways already, and there's room to grow there. It's when we get into the world of verification and actually understanding what the best available source is that it gets a lot harder. A lot of the world's data is still locked away in terrible spreadsheets, or it's locked away in the minds of statisticians. The number of times where I have had to call a statistician and understand why there is an anomaly in the data, and they'll explain to me that actually there's a caveat to this piece of data that is published on a completely different website in another spreadsheet locked away, and that caveat, without that caveat, you can't make sense of the data that you're presenting. So a good example of this is in population statistics. There often is a bit of a dip around the World War I and World War II. And if you show that without that extra information, it's kind of meaningless. You need to understand why there is that dip. And without actually having that extra layer of information, without understanding that caveat to that data, you can't actually give people a correct assessment over time. So there's a world of actually understanding how we're extracting information from the people who create it in the most meaningful way. And I don't really think enough work is done there. In the UK, we have the Office for National Statistics that actually has an API for all of the national statistics that is trying to capture caveats according to a taxonomy that the Full Fact team and I came together, came up with a few years ago. And I really hope that other official statistics bodies around the world try and pick that up eventually. But I think that is going to be a big blocker to doing fancy statistical checking over time. The other things that I think, and this is where I'm going to leave you because you're much smarter than I am and can tell me more about generative AI, but some of the things that I think that are interesting to think about in how we use this corpus of fact checks that we have. There are hundreds of thousands of fact checks around the world now that are captured in this schema, claim review schema, which is open and freely available. And actually on the Google site, there's the fact check API, which you can use, and that will give you all the access to the fact checks. But there's a lot of data that isn't captured in claim review schema. So what you see in schema is like the claim that's being checked, the source, the rating, maybe the link to the original misinformation. But what you don't necessarily get are things like the questions and answers that the fact checker has had to ask in order to actually get to that conclusion. Is there space to grow in that, like actually capturing more of the thinking that takes place behind the fact checking in that check stage? Is there more that we could be capturing? Could we actually be doing a better job of capturing the sources themselves? Fact checks are an incredible place to get authoritative primary sources. And actually things like Wikipedia are great, but they rely on secondary sources, not primary sources. That is the tenet of Wikipedia, is actually it only accepts secondary sources as a rule. So where do we go in the world to get primary sources? As a good alternative, fact checks are there for us at the moment, capturing primary sources around the world. And I don't think we're making enough use of that. One of the things that I've been thinking about is how we capture harms over time. So at the moment, I told you at the beginning that during the monitoring and spotting stage, fact checkers are thinking about what harm is this misinformation going to cause, and that's why they choose to go and check it. But we don't capture that in the claim review schema in any meaningful way. And so we actually miss out on a really important piece of thinking that happens in that stage. And I'm exploring at the moment whether we should be capturing harms over time, and whether that actually gives us fantastic insights into the kinds of things that we can mitigate against. And then finally, just not necessarily a generative AI thing, but I think that fact checks also tell us where data isn't doing a good enough job. So the data being published isn't doing a good enough job, or corrections aren't happening fast enough. And I think that we can also use that to generate insights over time, not just for technology reasons, but actually for societal reasons about places which we could do more. So I'm going to leave you with that. And if you got any questions, I would love to answer them if I can. Thanks.
I think there are a couple questions in the chat. People, maybe do you want people to just, kind of unmute and ask you directly? I think that's better.
Yes, please. Yeah, I'd love that.
Please go ahead. So let me try to go with the order. I see a hand raised. Yeah, Mark, just bear with us a little bit. Let's start with Tarlington. Do you want to ask directly, Tarlington?
Well, I think Maven answered it. I think we can come to it in the
Okay,
panel.
sure.
Please.
And then the next question came from Jueqing. Do you want to ask directly?
Yeah, a very nice talk. Thank you. So I mostly work on hate speech. I don't work on like misinformation. I'm just curious about whether are these fact checkers, how are they evaluated? And also to what extent are they automated?
Yeah, good question. So to what extent are they evaluated? This is why I included the section on the standards bodies, because essentially it's the standards bodies at the moment that are identifying the level to be an IFCN certified fact checker. You do have to regularly meet a certain standard, and it is an evaluation that happens every single year. And that is the primary way that people are evaluated in an open ecosystem. Privately, I'm sure all the platforms have different ways of also assessing their own ideas of what quality is. But just to tell you a bit more about the code of practice, sorry, not the code of practice, the code of standards for the International Fact Checking Network, part of it is a commitment to non-partisanship and fairness. And so that actually goes all the way down to how the organization is set up, where its money is coming from, who are the owners of the organization, what are its ethical editorial standards, what is its own correction process. Another principle is commitment to standards and transparency of sources. So never actually always being more transparent than really any other publication I've seen. A lot of like news organizations will link to themselves instead of linking out. And fact checkers do the exact opposite. Fact checkers will link out to all the primary sources. They don't really care about keeping people on their websites in the same way. They care about showing people the primary data. And that transparency of sourcing is actually incredibly valuable. And all of the people who are IFCN certified meet that to a high standard. We've already covered funding and organization transparency. Transparency and standards and methodology as well. So there's certain gold standard things that are expected of fact checkers, and that will look like, for example, 2 people generating a fact check from scratch. So someone might do the research, but then somebody else will actually go and redo that research from first principles and then compare. And that's considered a gold standard approach in that world to what a good methodology looks like. And there are various checks and balances in place for different types of checking. I think if I could impart one thing, it's people think of fact checking. I didn't really make this point in the slides, but people think of fact checking as one amorphous thing, like there's a claim and we'll check it and the process will be the same. But realistically, different types of claims have different ways that you check it. And so, for example, a claim that's a statistical claim will have a particular path. A statistical claim for immigration will have its own path. But actually, a claim that's based on a narrative, like the one that we spoke about earlier, or a claim that's about a racial group, will have a completely different way of being approached and a different way of being communicated. And that's just because it requires different things. Like one's a numerical claim, it's pretty straightforward to check. Is it that or is it not? What's the ambiguity? What's the caveat? The other one is actually about what are the norms in a society. And we can't just give numbers towards that. We can give numbers to help us paint a picture, but we actually have to include lived experience. We actually have to include the many different versions of the truth that exist in that world. And so the transparency of methodology to get to those different types of checking and those different types of communication are very important. You had a part 2 to your question that I've forgotten. It was
yeah. So that actually well, what you just said, it actually comes like that question will be a follow up. So like because there are sounds like there are a lot of different categories of factor checking, and to what extent can they be automated?
That's it. Yeah. Okay, got you. Yeah, and it does come down to the different types of checking. So for statistical checks, the people that I know that do have done some sort of automated fact checking are Full Fact in the UK, Medan in the US, Duke University in the US as well, Factix in Norway, and a couple, there's one called Neutral, and an organization called EOS Fatos in Brazil. They've done quite deep automated fact checking, and also Andreas Vlachos and Cambridge University have done approaches to automated fact checking, but realistically, it comes down to the different types of checks. So a statistical check can be parsed, and if the data is available, you could make an assumption. But actually, the ones that, let me give you an example to make this real. If I say poverty is rising, and this happened every week essentially for about a year in the UK, a politician would get up and say poverty is rising, and then the other politician would get up and say no, poverty is going down, and then they would just talk like that for about 5 minutes, and everybody in the UK would be annoyed and would be like, what's happening? Why are our politicians saying the polar opposite things? And everybody would lose trust in the political system. If you look at the data, there are 2 measures of poverty: absolute and relative poverty. One's going up, the other's going down. So what's happening is that there's a very selective picking of which one that they're going to use. And so there's a real question that comes in automated fact checking, like if the statement is just poverty is rising, you could see a system coming in and going, yeah, that's true. And then at the same time, the system would also say the same thing for poverty is decreasing. But without that added piece of information that there are 2 measures of poverty, absolute and relative, and here are the times we use this one, and here are the times we use that one, or you have to present both so that the user can make up their own mind. Without that added extra layer of inference, then automated fact checking isn't as meaningful and actually has the capacity to cause more confusion. And so it really depends on the domain, and it really depends on capturing that extra layer of information.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks a lot.
I hope that was helpful.
Okay, great. And I think Mark, do you still want to ask your question? You had your hand up.
So is that me? I'm afraid not.
No worries, Mark. Maybe next time.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. And yeah, I think Tarnita has another question. Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Just as long as time. Maven, that was fantastic. I'm curious if I just would love to hear your thoughts on the kind of relationship between fact-checking organizations and social media platforms. I know there was quite a bit of tension and mismatch when Facebook was trying to institute it. I'm thinking about Mike Anani's report for the Knight Foundation. But I'm curious where it is now. So how do you think that what the fact-checking orgs do and what the social media platforms want or don't want, like how's that meshing these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it's really important to remember that everyone wants the same thing. Everybody wants to remove the harms of bad information and to protect people from risk to life, to protect people from scams. The difficulty comes into it when it's sort of about the values with which how different people approach that problem. There are some platforms that want to take a very open approach to fixing it, but taking an open approach means opening up data, maybe in some cases not wanting to pay for opening up that data. Some platforms want to take a very closed approach, would rather have individual relationships and treat it as something that they pay fact checkers for, and then they get the benefits of those fact checks. I think both are limited in some ways, right? But the open model means that the fact checkers don't have a sustainable income and rely on grants. The closed approach means that nobody else benefits from that data. And actually, this is an ecosystem-wide problem that isn't going to go away. And what we're going to see over the next 10 years is a whole bunch of new social media platforms popping up all over the place. And at the moment, they're having to start trust and safety teams from scratch. They're not benefiting from all the closed data that is hidden away in XYZ company. And that actually means we all suffer at the end of the day. And I think that amongst all that is a tension of resource. But again, I want to zoom out and remember that we all want the same thing. It's just about how do we strategically get to the point where we're making it as open as it can be, we're enabling fact checkers to exist and do that work. And also we're getting the maximum benefit of the work that already is out there. That's something that keeps me up at night, so I don't really have any good answers to it at the moment, but I enjoy thinking about it.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Maven, for the questions. No, for the answers. And are there any questions in the room? Because okay, yeah, go ahead.
One question about funding.
You come here to ask, yeah,
I can-
ask directly, yeah, so she can hear it. Yeah.
Sorry, my legs are a bit sleepy.
Okay, yeah.
I can hear. I can hear.
Okay. Yeah.
So the question's about funding. So you've mentioned about how the fact checkers rely on grants. So how reliable and secure are these sources of funding, especially grants? So are the fact checkers always doing job search elsewhere because they have no job security in a sense?
Yeah, I'd say most fact checkers right now in the world don't have job security. And actually, it's a big drain on their resources. Sorry, say that again?
So is that a big risk for the future of fact checking as a system that kind of gives us this facts, secure facts, basically?
Yeah, I think it is a risk, and just being very open with you all, I think it is a risk. So Google recently made a £13.2 million fund available to fact checkers around the world. It's called the Global Fact Check Fund, and that will fund fact checkers for at least the next 3 years. Facebook has its third-party fact-checking program, which actually has individual relationships with fact checkers and funds them. It's unclear how long Facebook is going to keep that running, but it's in place at the moment, and it does fund a lot of fact checkers around the world. The reality is, and I'm saying this as somebody who worked in that space for 7 years, funding was the biggest existential crisis that we had all the time. And I started as a fact checker, I started in that team, and then eventually became deputy CEO. And my job as a fact checker was to worry about misinformation. And then my job as the deputy CEO was to worry about funding and to remove that worry from everyone else. More and more, though, we are seeing fact checkers come into earned income streams. So there are more contracts, essentially, for doing bespoke types of fact checking or for doing training. And there are grants being made available, definitely through various funds. Like I've already mentioned the Google one, but also we made something called the European Media Information Fund available, and that was like 20 million for media literacy efforts around the world. So we're trying our best to put money into the system and to support fact checkers, but in a world where we're still trying to figure out what are the relationships between the content producers and the platforms, then that's not just the thing that exists with fact checkers, it's the thing that still exists with newsrooms around the world. It's still a thing that exists with blogs around the world, right? Like recipe websites around the world. Like this is a thing that is still hotly debated in legislation.
Thank you.
Great question, good answer. Yeah. Any other questions in the room? Yeah. Go ahead. Loud.
Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So with like all of these large language models and generative AI being on the rise, claim that's often being made is that the easy access to these models will amplify the amount of misinformation that's out there in the world. Like, you as an expert on fact checking and disinformation, do you think that, like, for the individual, will this be a reasonable risk that will be actually felt? Like, for example, the amount of misinformation I'm going to see on social media?
Yeah, it's a good question. And these are the times when I really wish we had more data. I really would love to be able to say there's X amount of misinformation in the world and here's how it's changing. But I can't. So with that huge caveat, I'll tell you what my personal opinion is, but I am very happy to be wrong, and I hope I am wrong, and I probably am, just because that's how the world works. So I think that, will there be more misinformation? I think there'll probably, like, the total set of misinformation, I think there's a really long tail to all this stuff, right? There's like a big spike of stuff, and then there's a really long tail. And I think that tail is still going to exist and maybe just be like even longer. I think the thing that will probably change is the types of misinformation that fall into the harmful category will get bigger, because it will be easier to make more harmful misinformation. So I'm talking like, I mean, even just the examples we've seen recently, like I saw a thread of politicians who will generate images that were of politicians having affairs with, like, in hotel rooms, kissing other people, that definitely didn't happen, were all generated. But if things like that are released at a crucial point in time during the election cycle, that causes quite a lot of confusion. And the issue isn't necessarily the amount of misinfo. The issue is the time that things are released cause, especially around an election, whether they're harmful or not, if they confuse people, they will drastically affect the outcome. Because it's actually a very well-known disempowerment tactic. To stop people going out and voting is just flood them with information, flood them with images that they can't make head or tail of, flood them with claims that make them feel stupid because they don't know if it's true or not, and then watch them recede back into their lives, into the places where they feel comfortable, and actually not engage with the political process, not be democratic, not go out and vote. It's a very well-known way to disenfranchise certain groups of voters, and has been used in the past to great effect and to get certain results. So that's my fear around generative AI, is that just the stuff that is made is going to cause confusion, and will probably be in the category of more harmful or just more bombarding at a certain period in time. And also, like we've already spoken about, our fact checkers they're running on empty. I think we have to really be careful about when these tools are used and how they might be used, not just to generate stuff, but to actually just generate a feeling in society that might have a negative outcome.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that basically there's a difference in the volume of misinformation out there, because if I come back to the example that you were saying, I could, if I had the skills, do like similar images in Photoshop, right? And this could have been done also for the last few years. And now I think the main difference is maybe that you can more easily generate misinformation at scale. You're saying that's basically what's the key difference here?
You can generate harmful misinformation at scale.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. I think the harmful is a really important addition there. It's not just because there's lots of misinformation that doesn't really matter, right? If it's true or false, it's not really going to have an effect on someone. Like, you're allowed to be wrong. You're allowed to be wrong on the internet, but it's just when it like falls into the world of harm, that's the place where we have to make sure that that's not having an extreme effect on certain people or certain systems.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, thank you so much, Maven. It's a wonderful talk, and as you can see, there's a lot of interest and very informative. Hopefully, you also find it interesting. And yeah, we won't take more of your time. I know you are exhausted, and thank you so much. Hope to see you next time in a different session. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully in person next time. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Bye.
Yeah, and yeah, bye. And I think for the audience in the room and online, how about we take a break and come back at, if you can, 10:25. We give Tarlington 5 more minutes to give the talk. Our speaker from 10 to 10:30 has a conflict. So Tarlington, as you can see, he does a lot of the right at the intersection of technology and the social media. So he'll have a lot to share. Tarlington, is that okay? We started from 10:25 with your talk. I hope that's okay. Yeah. Yeah, sounds great. Yeah. Okay, we'll see you back at 10:25. There should be some coffee, snacks right around this time, provided by the conference. Thank you, everyone.
unmute, but I think someone on the call has to speak.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh, maybe I can.
I can speak. I was on the call.
Okay.
And yeah, I think so. Colleague,
Yes, sorry.
I don't remember how it's actually called. But oh, it shouldn't be going from here.
This is for the camera, right?
This one for speaker.
Oh, this is for the speaker?
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, that one actually connected for.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, so, no.
You need to get to the link again.
Yeah.
Speak? Oh my God.
Yes, I'm from here. Did you change?
Oh, this is a fitness company here for a person.
Oh, nice.
That's great. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's yours. Yes, thank you for connecting.
What? Okay. Can you hear me? No. Maybe if I maybe if I go outside. Can you hear me now? Yeah, that was the problem before.
I will get team specific for you right now. Okay.
Okay, but thank you.
Hello, people on Zoom. Just wondering if you could say something quickly to see if we can hear you.
I can hear you. How's that sound? You hear that? I'm talking now. Can you hear me? No audio.
Whether something
Can you hear me in the room? Okay. Seeing if you can hear me in the room. Sounds like people on Zoom can hear me. I hear the room audio.
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Still talking? Not sure what to say.
Yeah, sorry, Talton, we can't hear you at the moment. We're just going to try something else. Thank you. Like a test subject.
I'll say something every once in a while, in case you can hear me.
Wait, sorry, say something again, Talton.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, wow, look at that.
Yes.
Modern technology, incredible. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And then stop sharing. All right.
Should I try sharing my screen?
Yeah, you can share your screen. And we are enjoying lively conversation in the room, although there's no, I didn't find any coffee or snack, but nice to have a break. So, there's an echo.
You have the title page of my talk?
Yes, you can see.
Good.
All right, let me get you started, Tarlington, and then you can unmute. Yeah. All right.
Whatever you need.
There is an echo. Is it because of your? Make sure you are muted. You're muted. Okay. Still an echo?
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you. All right, let's get started. We have Tarlington, who is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and his work is really right at the intersection for technology and social media. And he also has a book that I think is nominated for finalists for the book award. And without further ado, I will let you take away, Tarlington, and you'll have until 11, and then we go right into the panel.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. At this point, because I'm sharing screens, I can't see the chat, so I will try to dive out of the screens near the end in case there's questions. How's the sound? Can you hear me?
Very well, yes.
Great, excellent. Great, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you. I took from the kind of abstract of the workshop that part of the impulse is that there are many people in the computer vision world who either are beginning to think about content moderation or would like the field to think about it more, which I applaud. So what I thought I would offer is kind of here's what you're getting into kind of story, because I think that there are technical challenges, but I also want to highlight the social and sociological challenges as well. So, depending on how you count, we are in the sort of 4th decade of the project of content moderation, and I'll talk about why I extend that out to the time frame that I do. Sorry, I'm hearing audio. Just if you need my attention, let me know. Content moderation as a kind of like societal challenge has become certainly a massive challenge for social media platforms, where a lot of this work is done. Increasingly a technical challenge. So how platforms can identify violations with software rather than or alongside a human review. It's become a testy political and regulatory concern, both in the US, North America, and around the world. That's an important part of the story. And it's becoming a part of a much broader array of information services. We talked a bit about sort of LLMs and AI chat, but I think we're seeing content moderation as a phenomenon in a lot of different places. And so given that it's such a massive undertaking, that it now takes so much attention in the public discussion, the regulatory discussion, it's easy to forget that at least at the start, it was a tiny and often overlooked piece of the work and the priorities of early social media platforms. So that's where I want to start, is I want to tell two histories. And if you've been paying attention to content moderation in the sort of public and press, you'll be familiar with the first one, but I think it's important to highlight both. So many of the social media platforms that we still use began with no content moderation in place whatsoever, and had to discover the need for it along the way. And that's despite the fact that users of the web and online users of the web knew full well the kind of problems they could run into, whether that's pornography they didn't want to see, trolling and griefing activities, cyberbullying, hate speech, what have you. So just an example, Facebook, when it first launched, began with a series of volunteer Harvard undergrads who were there to handle customer service. Any complaints about content fell into that queue, but that was also who you reached out to if you lost your password or got locked out of your account. And it was 18 months before they hired anyone who was officially in charge of content moderation. At that point, there was a backlog of complaints numbering in the tens of thousands. And that's easy to pick on a company right when it's starting, but Twitter didn't have a way for people to complain about a specific tweet until 2013, which is quite a long time after its launch. And I think this is an important insight, both that content moderation was misunderstood as a small piece of the puzzle, but also that it was lumped into customer service. So I would argue that the social media platforms have continued to think about content moderation as customer service. And this has been part of how it has grown, and in some ways quite limiting in what they're supposed to be doing. So as these sites grew larger, the need for content moderation continued to grow as more and more people and more different groups of people began interacting with each other on social media. Though the realization of this by the platforms took a bit longer. It's worth remembering that platforms act ethically, but they also act financially. And so as these platforms are trying to scale up rapidly, and as they were desperate to turn a profit, the work of moderation didn't look particularly close to where profit was going to be generated, right? So it's a hard thing to invest in. I argued in my book that while content moderation was sort of seen as this kind of ancillary or small piece of the puzzle, I think it is the commodity that platforms were offering at the start. So if you think about the kinds of materials that were available on an early YouTube or an early Instagram, the distinction that they're making is that these things were available on the web, but here was a place where you could find them. They were easy to locate. They were all gathered together, interact with people around them on a single platform. And so what they're offering is both the kind of ease and efficiency of accessing content, but also accessing the right content. And whatever the offer of the right content was, whether that was fun or relevant or personalized or not spammy or not pornographic, all of those together were the offer that platforms were making. So content moderation is a piece of that, certainly those last two offers. So as these platforms grew, and especially as public concern grew, they began to expand how content moderation worked on these platforms, both in the range of categories of things they were worried about and the number of people and the resources they needed to do it. This included developing policies, but I think maybe more importantly, these platforms had to put in place an apparatus to do it, right? So how do you identify things? How do you adjudicate things? What do you do for content or users that you find violate the rules? Do you consider appeals in that process if you got it wrong? How do you update rules? How do you spread that task over different languages? This is an immense process that needs to be in place. And they also needed logic to justify why they were doing it. Why is it Facebook's job or YouTube's job or Instagram's job to decide what doesn't? And most of the platforms that I'm talking about now decided to extend this kind of customer service model out to what some people have called an industrial scale. So content moderation was sort of understood as something that platforms would do for us, for users, and made this offer that users would, in an ideal world, move through these platforms, never run into the things they didn't want, and have an easy process by which they could sort of complain about harassment or pornography or hate speech. And if you make that promise, right, that the platform is going to do it for you, then what's required is kind of speed, consistency. How do you identify things right away? How do you get them down right away? This was not seen, at least in the early days, as an act of governance. It was more like custodial work, sort of like if there's a mess, we clean it up. And certainly as a kind of customer service, as a kind of brand protection, right? So if you go to Instagram, you're going to find what you're supposed to find. If you go to Twitter, you're going to find what you're supposed to find. And also kind of liability avoidance, right? So sites didn't want to get sued. And the priorities that were driving this were certainly ethics and concern for harm, but also what would get a platform into legal trouble, what might get them on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in a way they didn't want to be, and what risked an exodus of users to a competitor, where if they were getting swamped by pornography and hate, would they just go somewhere else? Now, over the last decade or so, platforms have taken content moderation much more seriously than they did at the start. But at the same time, the thorny problems they face have gotten thornier. And the techniques of those who are eager to harass or distribute propaganda or disinformation or circulate hate have become more sophisticated. In this history that we're telling, major press coverage, certainly around Gamergate in 2014, but very much around the election in the US in 2016, the elections in India the same year, the Brexit vote, greatly expanded attention to content moderation as a problem that platforms were sort of failing to meet. As the need for content moderation and the kind of public scrutiny about content moderation grew, the process that the largest platforms undertook sort of shifted, right? What was being done in-house and depending on users to flag content and internal reviewers to decide what to do about it, tended to expand to third-party contractors that could identify and review flagged material. And we saw a massive investment in the development of automated software. So could this content be identified automatically rather than being identified by users? The other thing that's, I think, worth remembering if you're interested in this field and want to step into it is that certainly in 2018 and after, we see an increasing politicization of content moderation. So at least in the US, although you see these arguments made elsewhere, on the left, we see an increasing worry that platforms were failing to do enough to interrupt harassment, hate, misinformation. While on the right, we saw a kind of political opportunity to criticize moderation efforts as being politically biased, right? So platforms are getting it on both sides and there's no right thing they can do. If they intervene more, they get called biased. If they intervene less, they look like they're dropping the ball on protecting people. Now, that's the story that if you've been paying attention to the public debates about content moderation at all, is the one you probably know about. And it's certainly the one that draws the most interest and attention from journalists, the public, but also researchers and policymakers. But I think there's a second history, and it might be a bigger one, and it might be a more important one. So that's why I want to call it out. With a longer trajectory and a more diffuse narrative, but really one that might point us to making very different kinds of interventions if we had something to offer for this field. So remember, moderation doesn't have to mean content moderation. Let's start there, right? Or even involve being online. We use the phrase content moderation to mean online platforms protecting us from harmful content, but we might expand this and think about governance of collective endeavors, which, you know, being on TikTok is one. This conference has a code of conduct. I don't know if you've read it or not, but it dictates how we're supposed to treat each other in this environment. And it's not just about the online versions, it's about being in the room. Moderation here might be about what are those rules? plus who has the right to enforce them, what are the arrangements if someone is violating them, what happens, right? And it's unclear what that is. If someone in the room started to yell and shout and interrupt the process and shouted people down or be hateful, it's not clear what would happen, but there is something that exists that is meant to be moderation, that's supposed to guide both how this collective endeavor goes, but also what happens if someone decides to violate it or it's becoming problematic or unhealthy. So we keep that idea in mind. Then there's maybe like another one that like well before the emergence of social media platforms and the Facebooks and Twitters of the world, we had online communities, right? We had chat rooms, we had Usenet, we had bulletin boards, we had comment threads. Most of these were moderated by their organizers, by volunteer admins, by webmasters. The process was different. The number of people you were probably dealing with was quite a bit smaller. The kind of problems that needed to be dealt with overlapped with the problems that an Instagram might face, but probably focused more on resolving interpersonal conflict, maintaining a healthy community. And the people who specialized in that role came to be known as community managers. So maybe we could use that phrase instead of content moderators as another category. So the big social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter initially drew expertise from people who had come up the ranks in community management. But I think they soon split from those tactics as they felt they had to do the moderation sort of invisibly, below the process of using it and sort of have it work for you. But some of the larger platforms have continued a modified version of this. So the most prominent examples are Reddit and Wikipedia. It's also primarily how Facebook groups are managed, so managed by the organizer or a set of people who are moderating. And it happens in lots and lots and lots of smaller places. So intra-corporate sharing platforms, chat groups, Discord servers, Slack teams, right? All of these sort of small and mid-sized places where moderation still has to happen. There's still room for purposeful or incidental kind of harm and attacks and offense, but they don't happen on this massive scale the way that the handful of platforms that we overwhelmingly talk about. Also really important that this is how live streamers and content creators manage their own communities. So I threw Twitch up as an example. Twitch is interesting because Twitch moderates by requiring their streamers to moderate, right? So if you are streaming, you have an obligation to moderate the chat that happens below it. If you fail to do it, you can be held responsible, but then you have to have yourself or volunteer mods who are involved in that conversation and are kicking people off if they're being hateful or attacking or what have you. Also importantly, this is how instances of Mastodon and other sort of Fediverse platforms handle it as well. And there's been a lot of interest in that, especially as Twitter has changed. So while this is sort of less visible as part of the story, we could argue that it's a bigger need, right? There's way more people who are running these kinds of spaces, or way more people who are touching those kinds of spaces rather than Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and a handful of others. Now, the tools of this work are quite different primarily because moderator is usually known to the community and works with the same community over a period of time. So it's much more about trust and sustainability and expertise that you don't really see. If I have a post deleted from Facebook, I don't know who made that decision. I don't really know, if I have 2 posts taken down, it's not by the same person, right? But in a community management arrangement, it's probably the same people. I probably know who they are. I can DM them and ask them why. So it's much more about social relations than the industrial mode. And importantly, this is almost entirely volunteer work. It's unpaid and has little support from the platforms that they work for. And this has been quite important. So in the last week or two, if you've paid attention, Reddit moderators have blacked out some of their subreddits as a protest for Reddit failing to give the kind of tools they need. Moderators at Stack Exchange went on strike because the policy about AI-generated content had changed and they disagreed with it. So this is an ongoing concern, right? But it doesn't get the same kind of press coverage or research attention as Facebook and YouTube and what have you. So that's my 2 histories. I think they live concurrently. I think we focus on one way more than the other, but I think if you care about content moderation, or if you have the expertise to bring to the problem, I'd want to think really carefully about where you're intervening, right? And not default to one if there's something you can offer to the other. So let me spend the rest of the time highlighting what I'm calling 3 problems. They're just the things that are pressing in my mind, but I think they're worth kind of having on the table. We tend to focus, I think, in the research, but especially in the kind of public discussion about who sets the rules and then how do we identify things that violate them, right? That seems like the bulk of what content moderation is for. And certainly people who have technical expertise in computer vision are going to be relevant, especially for that second part about how to identify something that might be problematic. And maybe because we're sort of all users and citizens, we may care about the kind of political question, right? How do you balance harm versus speech? Who has the right to moderate? I want to start with a problem that I think is overlooked, and I'm glad to see that later in the session there's someone who's thinking about this quite directly. So I won't belabor it because I think we'll have time to hear about it more. But the question is sort of who does the work of moderation, right? So we've been invited by those platforms to forget that this is work, right? We get on Facebook and we either have a perfect experience where nothing offensive or horrible happens, or something horrible happens and there's a process and we say flag or click or object, and then something happens later on. But the work of doing that is sort of invisible to most users. And as it turns out, especially this industrial scale requires an immense amount of human labor in both of these versions, right? So in the commercial content version, there are all of these kind of third-party workers that are working around the world who are reviewing the material that has been flagged either by users or by automated software. And then in the community management work, that's also an immensely sort of time-consuming and thankless kind of work. So as the major platforms grew and they struggled with the limits of their advertising revenue model and the growing demands both from users and the press and regulators for more moderation, they outsourced most of this work to third-party companies. They were hired around the world, often under quite exploitative terms. And their job is to assess some of the worst content imaginable. We're talking, it's very hard to count, but we're talking tens of thousands of people who do this work, right? For just the major platforms, not to mention work like this in other venues. And the challenge of this work, if you think about it, is that you're asking people to make sometimes quite subtle judgments, right? What counts as harassment? What counts as explicit? What counts as too violent? Across way too wide an array of languages and cultures, right? So how many of those are value-laden judgments, right? What is sexually suggestive in the US? What is sexually suggestive in Indonesia? What is sexually suggestive in Brazil? Those are all different things. They have to do this incredibly fast, and platforms want them to be consistent. And while doing that work, they are sometimes exposed to some of the most horrific content imaginable, right? And I really do wonder about this process. Like, what does it mean not only to have to face horrific content, but to be asked to face horrific content that there's no question about taking it down, and then make a subtle judgment about something that is like just over the line, right? And that's the kind of work that we're asking people to do. And then if we want to be concerned about the work, then we can add to that the labor of community managers and Slack channel mods and subredditors and Mastodon instance moderators and Facebook group admins and Twitch channel mods. And then there's a whole set of kind of secondary people involved. So experts that get enlisted to advise platforms on geopolitical strife or linguistic specificity or particular problems like domestic violence or suicide. And then add to that the people who are handling appeals and setting policy, training moderators, providing wellness to moderators. This is an immense human effort, and it will continue to be a human effort for a long time to come. And so there are institutional, psychological, societal, and technological questions on how to support that work. If we think about our job being, let's provide the tools to platforms to automatically identify something bad, we forget that we might provide tools to people who are tasked with reviewing this. What tools do they need, right? How do we support their work? So problem number 2 is the question of automating this work. And obviously, as the amount of content grows, as the problems proliferate, and as you start to worry about what it takes for humans to review this, then the obvious suggestion is, well, how much of this can we automate, right? Either be more efficient, great reason, or to protect people from having to look at stuff, which is also a great reason. Early on, as there was this kind of increasing pressure about toxicity and hate, pornography, many of the platforms promise that this would be a problem that would eventually be solved, right? So machine learning and automated identification would replace human moderation, and even replace the need for users to ever flag content because they would never even see it. The evidence has quickly suggested that this was an optimistic claim. And now most platforms treat these tools as sort of a partner tool with human review. So in most cases, the software that could identify toxic material, hateful material, pornographic material is identifying it and then putting it into a queue to be seen by a human, because the judgment is too difficult to be left to the software. Now that changed a little bit in 2020 because of COVID lockdowns. And so many of these platforms had these massive workforces, but they had to send them home. And so a number of them started to experiment with just going ahead and making the decision with the software, not just identifying it, but counting on that identification as reason to remove a post, remove an image, suspend a user. Now, again, there's a great deal of promise in wanting to do this. I support the effort, but there are a couple of kind of key problems when we try to automate content moderation. The first one is what exactly is being proxied? So for instance, there's always a mismatch between what software can detect and what we're actually looking for. And that gap is sometimes large and sometimes small, but it's very hard to make it disappear. So for example, if we have software that is very effectively identifying skin tone and body shape, that's a proxy for nudity and a pretty good proxy for nudity. But it's not the same as pornography. Those categories are different. It's easy to prove that. We could say, well, some nudity is not pornographic, like babies and health charts. Some pornography does not involve nudity. Those things don't overlap perfectly. But more importantly, assessing whether there's nudity in an image is an empirical judgment. But assessing whether there's pornography in an image is a cultural judgment. Pornography is a latent value that says unacceptable sexuality, right? Or adult-only sexuality or explicit sexuality. So we're never going to be automating the judgment of pornography. We're always going to be automating the judgment of nudity and bodies and hoping that that is a close approximation. The second question is whose judgment is being proxied, right? So if we have machine learning tools that are supposed to identify hate speech or harassing behavior, those depend on a corpus of data that's been trained on, that's been rated for things that are harassing or hateful, that are toxic. And that means that a set of human judgments, whether that was a bunch of click workers that rated content for us, or all the decisions the platform made in the past that are then being used to train the tool going forward, that's a set of human judgments that are then being proxied to stand in for the current community's judgment, right? So why their judgment? What's missing from that judgment? Because in some ways, if this is governance, we expect that the judgment that's being represented or embodied belongs to the community, but in a training data relationship, it doesn't, right? So what is the relationship between who rated these things as hateful, such that when you train the tool, it tried to approximate that judgment, and that's now being imposed on a new set of people. And the last is that the stakes around error are quite misaligned. So if I have an image recognition tool in my Apple Photos app that tries to put all the photos together that have the same face, if it's mostly right, that's fine. And it misses a couple things, that's fine. And the approximation is effective. The false positives and false negatives are not great, but they're acceptable. But when we think about content moderation, we're dealing with things where false positives and false negatives can be devastating. And by definition, the places we fight about content moderation are those difficult edges, are those places where, like, is this harassment or is it not? Is it hateful? Is it not? Is it sexually explicit or is it not? So the very place where the tools are going to make errors are exactly where content moderation matters the most, at least from a kind of like legitimacy standpoint. Okay, the last problem I want to highlight is that if we buy into history 1 and forget about history 2, if we focus on content removal and suspension as being like the key part, right? How do you set the rules? How do you identify it? How do you get rid of it? We're going to miss the fact that content moderation has been expanding as a tactic, as a practice. So the first is that moderation happens everywhere. There was an interesting article not so long ago about how Peloton had to institute content moderation because people were saying filthy things in their usernames, right? It's not a place where you'd think there'd be content moderation, but the same impulses apply. What's unacceptable in this environment where I can say something dirty and make it show up on your screen, right? App stores, search, gaming environments, payment platforms, VR and AR metaverse environments, which opens a huge amount of problems. And then certainly AI chatbots and LLMs. It also covers a much wider array of problem categories. So we tend to focus on kind of the big four. It's like sex, violence, hate, harassment, misinformation, maybe as a fifth category. Those dominate our concerns. Conspiracy, self-harm, pro-anorexia, animal abuse, prohibited commerce, the tactics of coordinated attacks, low quality content, repeated content, deepfakes. There are an enormous range of things that people might want to moderate in some environment that require different kind of technical interventions, but also different kind of cultural and political savvy. And the last one I would highlight is that moderation happens in different ways besides removal. So I've written about this a lot. Many platforms have moved to reducing content that they find problematic rather than removing content. So reducing in this sense, it's still on the platform, it's there if you can find it, but in an algorithmic recommendation, right? Next videos to watch, top of the list for you, it doesn't show up there, or it shows up less, right? And this is important to me because I find it fascinating as a tactic, but it's important because that means different groups of people at the platforms are doing moderation work. Different questions of transparency and accountability arise. What does it mean that a platform can say, this content can exist, but no one will find it, and no one can tell that's happened, right? And this leaves users very suspicious, right? The other question here is that users have to feel that this system is legitimate. And when users say, I don't know why my video didn't circulate, but I can't prove that it wasn't just because no one cared, then we've got a legitimacy problem. It's not about identification, not about the right rule, but it's about sustaining this. So I hope that I've given you kind of a broader sense of this landscape. 3 takeaways. One is there's nothing neutral about content moderation. We often think it should be neutral, but can't be. And I would argue it shouldn't be. Content moderation is human judgment. It needs to be human judgment. Context matters, values change, cultural specificity matters. So content moderation is not a rule that we can enforce, but it's a cultural process that we're in constant debate about where the lines are, right? We create the lines even as we engage in moderation. The second is that content moderation is challenging, it's politically fraught, it's culturally and linguistically diverse. That has to be remembered if you're designing tools that are going to do this, especially in the question of whose training data are you using, whose value judgments are you codifying into the system. And the last is, whose problem do you actually want to solve? The platforms would love it for the technical field to solve their problems for them, to continue that customer service model, right? The customer service model, the platform finding harm and getting rid of it is just one part of this puzzle. There's also the need for tools for volunteer moderators, for community managers, for users themselves, for the commercial moderation workers that are working a terrible role in this. How do we build to be committed to transparency in a way that platforms do and don't care about? And what about tools that aren't just about identification, but also support other practices, like how to navigate these spaces, how to collaborate in the community to have governance, and how to adjudicate democratically rather than sort of behind the scenes. I'll leave it there. If you're interested in all of this, I have a book. There's a free copy. I hope you enjoy. Happy to take questions.
I think let's take the questions in the panel discussion. And Chris and David, come up and moderate. Let's see. Oh, Matt actually already has a question, or let me see. We can probably start from that. And why don't you come up and moderate? Let's see. Okay, great. I see this. Yeah, it's a great segue to Matt's talk. And we have Pamela We have Matty, feel free to join as well. We have who else? It's Maven still here. Lama is also here. Yeah. If the panelists, if you could turn on your camera, and the moderators, do you want to come up? And yeah, get it started.
Yeah, I'll do it.
All right, we're co-moderating and you probably cannot see us, but can you hear our voice? No, it's fine. We can be the
switch to
mystery
the front
moderators. Okay,
Oh,
I don't know.
you
I don't want to
can-
touch it.
Here.
Okay,
The camera is looking here. Why don't you?
hi. So I don't know if you can hear me, but you've seen talks by the panelists, except for Renee DiResta. We're very happy that she comes in a very blurry webcam, which is like very artistic. I like it.
I can't figure out why. I'm so sorry.
It's good, it's good. So, but because we have new people coming in the room and people leaving, can we just very quickly go through our panelists and you introduce yourself again quickly, what you do, where you're from, and what keeps you up at night. And then let's dive into questions right away after that. And because Renee is new, let's start with you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed watching some of the presentations, and I apologize for not being able to give one. I have a book deadline in about 4 weeks, and I'm so behind. I'm the technical research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. We work on kind of 4 main things. There's trust and safety, which is a lot of what Charlton was talking about, just the real kind of terrible stuff that happens on the internet, how we think about content moderation. Then there is information integrity, which is the mis and disinformation work. Then there is what we call emerging technology. So we spend quite a lot of time right now, and actually for the past 3 years or so, on generative AI, new and emerging platforms. We spend a lot of time on end-to-end encryption as well. And then the kind of final bucket is policy. We tend to think about the internet as a holistic system. And so when new and novel technologies come in, for example, in the form of generative AI, that impacts trust and safety. So I think as far as what keeps me up at night, I've spent a lot of time on child safety recently, which is a bit of a departure from my normal work. But unfortunately, there's some pretty extraordinary things that are happening with the intersection of generative images and child safety on the internet right now. And so that has been taking up a fairly significant amount of my time.
Thank you. Let's switch over to Lama and Pamela from OpenAI. And can you just quickly introduce yourself again? Even we saw your amazing talk earlier.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lama. I'm on the policy research team at OpenAI and work on red teaming, third-party auditing, and external assessments of our models. I guess what keeps me up, or what I'm most interested in tackling through my work at OpenAI, is better mechanisms for evaluating societal impact really quickly, because I think sometimes research can have a much slower feedback loop. And so finding ways to make research happen faster, but then also feed that research back into decisions that happen at OpenAI and other companies, platforms. That's what I'm most interested in. So I'll pass it to Pamela.
Hey everyone, I'm Pamela. I work on the policy research team at OpenAI, focused on socioeconomic impacts that look like less content-based harms. Is another way to sort of think about it. So labor market harms, over-reliance, dependency, things that emerge after sort of repeated interactions or are tied to deployment.
You want to keep moderating? Like I call people out. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. And then Tarleton, I know you just talked, but just repeat your introduction.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So Tarleton Gillespie, I'm officially at Microsoft Research in the Boston, Cambridge area, and I retain an affiliation with Cornell University, where I taught for a decade in communication and information science. And I'm kept awake by the simultaneous problem of worrying about all the stuff online that Renee was mentioning that I think is shockingly problematic. And also that we are sort of nearing and approaching kind of one way to handle this, and one that kind of believes in technically resolving most of it. And I worry that we're sort of giving away other models and other sort of societal theories of how one should govern such things.
And Mavan could not make it. She's out on a drink right now in Greece at her Obama Leadership Summit. Do we have one more panelist, Pietro, coming, or?
No, Pietro is joining the afternoon.
I'm seeing. Okay, okay, please, Matt. I only see the limited number of views up there. Where's Matt?
I'm saying that he's here, so he can join. Yeah.
I'm here. I'm on the panel in the afternoon, so you don't want to hear from me twice, right? I think I'd be, but whatever you guys want.
All right, I don't want to dominate asking questions right now, but I have actually, since Mavan is not here, let's pick up with Mavan. I really liked it when she ended her talk and said, yes, misinformation increased, but not every misinformation is equal. Like there's a long tail end, and it really depends when you do it and how harmful it is. And now we're like in the fourth wave of panic that Gen AI can automate misinformation and harm and so on. And there, I always hear this argument. This time it's even worse because you can do it at scale. AI can automate it. But then when we talk to experts, you can create a lot of like low impact harm and low impact misinformation that doesn't influence society too much. I'm doing this very controversial to you right now because most of you will disagree. But in order to have sort of very high impact, high harmful misinformation, you still need humans to do that. So is it actually true that fear that AI can do this much better at scale? Or you still need a lot of humans to have the same kind of harmfulness at scale? So I'll give it back to the panelists and maybe Renee, because you looked at a lot of disinfo campaigns and you might have some strong opinions there.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to dive right in. I'll throw, it seems like people are using the chat, so I will throw in a paper that we wrote actually with OpenAI that we published back in January, kind of a big white paper asking the question, what specifically does generative AI change in the capacity for disinformation? So we tend to think about disinformation as a campaign, right? Not a piece of information that is wrong on the internet. So when we're looking at something, that involves, again, using the frame of disinformation, not misinformation, not people who are wrong on the internet, but something quite deliberate. We look at actors, right? So who has the power to do this now? So that changes a little bit. We look at what we call behaviors, which is what is the dynamic by which you make something happen. So in 2015, bots were, you could argue, marginally impactful, right? They could make things trend, and that was because Twitter was not particularly sophisticated at filtering out low-quality accounts. So anybody with a batch of bots could use, basic routine copy pasta. You could find them quite easily because they would make something trend. And when you make something trend, you capture the attention of the crowd. And the crowds are very factionalized at this point. It's not the entirety of the public. It's very much this sort of segment of the public. And so for a while there, if you had bots, you could capture attention. Then Twitter wised up, the sort of copy pasta dynamics, the low quality account metrics, a number of ways in which they responded to this adversarial dynamic by changing how they handled that, what they curated, what they surfaced, right? So the problem is not only the content and the creation of the content, the problem is also how do you get it in front of the eyeballs of the target audience? And so what is very interesting with generative AI is you will no longer have that copy pasta, that sort of effortless detection, short of like, there's some really shitty networks out there right now where you can actually still see the, as a large language model, kind of error messages getting blasted out when they're not particularly careful. So you do see, though, again, this interesting dynamic where all of a sudden automation actually just became interesting again. There's also now more of a capacity for response. There's more of a capacity for fine tuning. The cost to operate various, instead of having dedicated individual trolls sitting there carefully producing content, which is what we see from very sophisticated actors like Russia, you no longer really need to do that. And there's actually, I was looking at a kind of an econ paper recently that actually is trying to model out the significant cost changes that will happen as a result of this. So you have increased capacity, decreased cost, new kind of collection of actors who can do it. Platforms are going to have to figure out how to handle the detection of the less detectable content and networks. And then I think ultimately, though, there is, we tend to think about it just as an adversarial cat and mouse game. What comes next? So I'll drop the link to the paper in the chat for anybody interested, but I guess that would be my answer.
Anybody else want to chime in from the panel?
Yeah, I think as Ben mentioned, like we are like, I think one of the sort of major harms that can come from these systems is more sort of how it degrades your sort of general sense of truth or reality. So sort of how do you trust anything on the internet? And it makes verification and fact checking much harder because we know already that people are like pretty disinclined to believe any sort of fact checking claims. So that it sort of compounds that effect. So we're like actively exploring different kinds of provenance mechanisms, but even that is sort of, I think, more of a band-aid than a holistic solution.
I'll just add one more detail I think fits with both of those statements. So I think that the question that we've had to deal with in terms of misinformation has both been the fact it exists and also how it develops an appearance of legitimacy. Right. So if you click through kind of the, something that showed up on Twitter, it's not just that it's there, it's that it seemed to come from someone. It seemed to come from a network. It seemed to be validated by the fact that lots of other people had sent it around. And so part of what we had to watch was either how did you get your uncle to forward it and then you got it through a social relationship and that gave it credibility, or how did you manufacture the sense that lots of people are already talking about it, which gave it kind of collective credibility. And I think one of the places that we'll see, I don't think that, GPT tools change that. You can create an immense amount of text, but you still have to like get it to circulate. But I do think that the image tools, these are image tools that were designed purposefully to say, how do you take a realistic looking image that looks like only a camera could create it, add things to it at your whim, have them look like they were in camera, and have that be seamless, right? And so the very premise of what the tool is designed to do, which has all sorts of positive uses, is designed for deep. I don't mean intentionally designed for deepfakes, but it's designed to fake, right? That's what it does. So I think that, for instance, and I think this is what Maven was saying, at the right moment, the ability to produce a photo, not just that the photo is false, but that it comes out in a moment where it seems like only journalists could have produced it. And therefore seems to tell a story about a thing that actually happened. The one that I'm thinking about was when Donald Trump was facing indictments and it hadn't happened yet, and there were suddenly some photos that looked like he was being pulled from Mar-a-Lago by FBI agents, like in a kind of very physical way. Those photos look good. They looked really good, right? And they circulated both as a kind of like, did this happen? And other people going like, we know this didn't happen, but were these photos look good? And because it was sort of in a moment that the capacity to produce not just images, but visually legitimate images, I think is going to be like a pretty interesting challenge for the people who try to track disinformation campaigns.
Sorry, is it okay? Yeah, I think what's also interesting about those photos is they were created as a propaganda tool. They were created by Trump supporters actively as sort of fake images and never intended to be really disinformation other than to sort of drum up support. The other thing I'll say is that the models themselves aren't grounded in truth. And so I think how you sort of steer users to understand the fallibility of the systems, the fact that they hallucinate, make up facts, can make up facts in ways that sound really realistic is sort of active area of research that we're quite interested in the moment. And I think a lot of that comes down to sort of interface design and how we sort of think about guiding people toward places where these systems do work. Like it's not in anyone's interest to have people using them and believing, fake facts out of them or anything else. But a lot of that is sort of recognizing that they are just like much better at closed domain tasks. And how do we sort of get users to understand that and to, make that kind of use really simple and really straightforward.
Can I give a 2-finger too, Chris, or did you want to just move on? Okay. One of the things with the Trump photos, actually, one of the creators was actually Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat, right? And he disclosed that they were AI generated. And he disclosed in his Twitter thread, I'm just killing some time, having some fun here. But then they were decontextualized because once you take them out of that context and there is no watermark, we can talk about watermarking maybe later or something, but the ways in which even though the original creator disclosed that they were false, that does not mean that that disclosure stays attached to the image, right? So the content takes on a life of its own. And so then it becomes, do you trust the framing of the person who has put out the content, right? And that's the other piece with, when we think about generative text and the proliferation of bots and so on and so forth, the area where they fall down is that people don't trust the speaker. But when you have generated content where people also trust the speaker, that's where you have that kind of perfect storm of somebody with phenomenal reach and high trust. And again, you don't know for sure whether they themselves have been diluted or what their motivation is in sharing it. So you see them share for clout, for example, or for gaining attention, becoming getting a bigger following, being the person who breaks the news or whatever. But there was one really interesting moment that also happened with I happened to be awake and see it kind of go out as it went, which was this pretend image of an explosion at the quote unquote Pentagon. And it was really interesting because it was so shittily done. I mean, it was like it didn't look like the Pentagon. The physics of the building and the fence were wrong. This is not, you don't have like Venetian blind type slats or not pillars, so there are like really just basic flaws. But you still did see, again, like RT picked it up immediately and kind of boosted it. And it reminded me a lot of the very first disinformation campaign that the US really saw was this thing called Columbian Chemicals, which was the Internet Research Agency back on September 11th, 2014, started posting these pictures of dead horses, alleged, and then there was a whole website that they made. I don't know how many people remember this. This is like the deep cuts of manipulation on the internet. But it was September 11th, 2014. Twitter was, kind of like not new, but like not everybody was on it. And it was this, we called it a hoax at the time, right? Nobody knew what it was, but you had the executives from the chemical company are saying there's no explosion here. There are no dead horses. There's no black cloud. Nobody knows what the hell is going on. But then there's a Wikipedia page that's describing an explosion. There's a fake CNN website that is being tweeted out as if something has exploded, right? And this was done with really crude, basic tools. Again, on September 11th, but because it was September 11th, people were in a particular mindset to receive it. And so it did become an actual viral hoax. And that's the kind of thing where I am kind of curious to see, they kind of stopped that strategy. It didn't really work for them. They didn't accomplish very much, but now you have the potential to do it in a way that does result in things like targeting a company and trying to make a stock price drop, right? Or manipulating a financial market or something like that. So it becomes more of a risk as the kind of capacity for higher quality, quote unquote, hoaxes increases. And we don't really have any kind of response for that, short of the platforms kind of trying to take it down. But if they take something down that's real, they're accused of being censors. So it's really kind of a bad environment for the content moderators in this space now.
Yeah, actually, any question from the audience on the topic? Otherwise, I'll ask something actually that goes back, I think, to what Jonathan talked earlier. So he was talking about how, indeed, content moderation really need a set of human judgment, right, to be a proxy for a specific culture and community. Though I see also a problem in that, in the sense that the content that needs to be moderated is becoming more and more complex. The human that are maybe tasked sometimes with that moderation task are themselves, lacking maybe the right context to solve that task, or they are using their subjective, opinion on that matter. Now, eventually we would want fact checker for everything. I think that's the extreme, right? How do you think, Taleton, and everybody in the panel, how do you think we can really, mitigate this? The complexity of the task increasing, subjectivity becoming a lot more important, and then still need to make important decisions, right? Sometimes, even a different individual might, disagree, for example, on a specific decision. So how do you think we can scale and I think this actually goes along, I think, one of the questions in the chat that talks about how can we scale our solutions, really to make sure that we are still following the right policies. We are not, not just specifically about, yes or no, something like, for example, is there nudity, but really about something that is highly related to cultural, these ambiguous, let's say, and potentially subjective, matters.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for the question. I think that, one place I would start, but I'd love to open this up because I don't know what the answer is to this problem, is to remember that the platforms, at least, that have taken on content moderation are doing two things simultaneously. They are providing a service to a user, which with that comes the we're allowed to shape that service, just like, We want to make a good customer experience, and therefore, like, we can give you exactly what we think you want, right? And they are making a space for a public activity to which they have certain both legal obligations and sort of much broader societal obligations, right? And one of the things that was really hard for platforms was when they got bigger, the expectations changed. If you have a platform with 1,000 users and you go like, I only want to have images that are in like a pastel color, people go like, okay, weird, that's a service, right? But if you have 100 million users and you go, I want all images to be pastel, people go like, that's absurd. Like, we have business to conduct here and like real conversations. You don't get to impose that rule, right? And that the line between those things, there wasn't a neat distinction. So I think that until a couple of years ago, the platforms were very carefully and cleverly riding this line, right? We make a space for you all to do your thing. We are hands off. By the way, we're going to algorithmically design it so that you get a feed of exactly what you want, right? But that's not us like curating the way like a TV network does. That's just us helping you find what you want to find, right? And those sort of the tensions of doing those two things sort of collided in 2016, 2018, 2020 in a way that it became impossible to do both. So now you've got a dilemma because you're asking the right question. The work of moderating away highly complex tactical maneuvers to misinform, deep fakes that are incredibly subtle to discern, as well as things like an image that is sexually suggestive, but you might fall on the side of yes or no, depending on kind of like whose framework you're using to make that decision. From a kind of customer service model, it's like, well, we better figure out what our solution is. And that's why the question is really interesting, but I think in some ways assumes that the solution belongs to the platform, right? And in another version, the solution belongs to the community. And the problem is that when you're doing both simultaneously, and when you build a platform that says, oh, by the way, everyone on the platform is the community, which is what some of those platforms have said, you have sort of an impossible task. So I guess the beginning of my answer is to say the problems are themselves different, and the answer to different problems maybe belong in different hands, right? So if you can't leave it to a small community to recognize tactical disinformation campaigns that come outside that community, then you need some help from the platform. And that platform can identify not just like a false statement, but like actual actors that are coordinating on their platform or elsewhere and can do a very different thing, right? We're not surprised that platforms want to prevent people from hacking the system and stealing credit card information. They don't have to do that like consistently and fairly. They just have to stay ahead of the bad actors. But there are other things that say, to say what sexually suggestive is and not hand that decision, in part at least, to a group of people is a really strange choice. And you're always going to be awkwardly and problematically approximating norms or imposing your own. And so those are very different kinds of problems. But as soon as I say that, I can go like, oh God, I haven't like solved a problem. I've just created 19 more. But that's my job. Someone else go.
This isn't solving the problem, but what I would say is that this is an area of active conversation for folks at OpenAI and others. Some of you may have recently seen, we put out a call for grant proposals for what they're calling democratic inputs into AI. I don't know if it's necessarily democratic, but some sort of public input into some of these very content moderation adjacent decisions, how steerable models should be, under what circumstances, for example, models should provide medical advice or legal advice, and trying to get more data on preferences and how to match that to the actual model behavior is something that we're actively interested in. But then the challenge becomes like, how do you weight the input that you're going to get? Like, there are going to be minority opinions, there are going to be majority opinions, and it's not just as simple as let's go with what the majority says here. There are going to be many nuances. And then I think also things like model steerability and customization. I think what's different from the experience of like ChatGPT or a first-party experience of DALL-E is that we also give developers decision-making power to kind of adjust or fine-tune what they think is going to be appropriate in certain contexts. So that could be both like a good thing or a negative thing, depending on upstream, what kind of decisions do you make about what the model baseline refuses, compared to the levels of customizability customizability that come downstream. And yeah, so I just say that there is like also a complexity between this like third-party API offering compared to a first-party offering. But at the end of the day, we do make some upstream decisions that will ultimately affect what developers and other people can do.
I think it's really interesting to see moderation decisions now happening at the realm of content creation, because much of the universe of content moderation topics right now has been much more around the realm of dissemination, right? So these are kind of, you might think of them as two separate phases or two separate, you know, spheres maybe. And so the content creation is interesting because there's a lot of these questions around authenticity. Now that you've made everything very, very easy to do, what should the defaults be? I think on the dissemination front, one thing that has been interesting is watching the rise of decentralization in the social media space. I don't know how many people here are on Blue Sky or Mastodon. I've been on both for maybe 6 months now, I think. And or I think Blue Sky joined kind of at the end of, Mastodon the end of last year. It's been really interesting to see the dynamics of the kind of protocols, not platforms, to use Mike Masnick's term, framings for what moderation might look like in a more decentralized environment. And also to see, you know, even as Blue Sky is that, right, it is designed to be a protocol-based system whereby different servers, if you will, can moderate differently. You do still see, interestingly, right now, calls from the early adopter community who right now feel that it's a very kind of nice, peaceful place, and they want to maintain that. And so they are actually really calling for a much heavier sort of top-down, top-level moderation schema, if you will, that where I think that there's that realization that it has been built to not have that by default, right? To have that sort of composable moderation dynamic. It's very interesting to see people just want a space on the internet that is like normal, so to speak, that is not Twitter, basically. While at the same time, this sort of movement into moderation being much more devolved down to the kind of immediate controllers of the smaller community. Up until this week, I used to use Reddit as my example of like, look how great this is. You can have this like top level control where they take out the really, really terrible, heinous stuff. And then you have, you know, the cat community that doesn't want the dog pictures can say no dog pictures in this sub, right? I don't know what's happening with Reddit at the moment. I have not been a long time user, so I don't want to wade into unfamiliar territory. But literally up until this week, I was like, oh man, they really seem to figure something out with this kind of tiered hierarchical moderation structure around dissemination that is that seems very positive at giving communities more control over what they want.
Yes, so I'm not sure.
There's a question for the audience.
Right.
Yeah, please. They should be. Yeah, go for it.
That's perfect.
Is that a mic situation?
I think they should be able to hear you. Yeah, but try. Yeah.
Okay, can y'all hear me? I'll just be loud. All right, that's my job, I guess. Hi, my question is a little vague, but I guess it's kind of like asking for your thoughts around kind of like how you think that the evolution of kind of needing to keep up with the internet's zeitgeist to moderate content. Let me give you an example on the computer. Like Quickly the Frog in let's say 2014, maybe seeing on the internet means not a big deal. Late 2015, it means something. And then today again in Twitch chat, you spread it all the time. It's kind of harmless again because the meaning that comes with that particular image has changed. Right. And I feel like with generative AI, both, you know, image and text, I think that we are going to see like the rate of change of kind of the internet lingo and what things mean, like iterate faster. It's going to be harder to keep track of it. As someone who works in content moderation, something that I'm paying attention of, like what is hate speech today isn't going to be tomorrow and the day after that. And so you might you're always like not just one step behind, no, you're 2 steps behind. I'm just wondering if anyone's like thinking or concerned about something.
I mean, I can plus one that statement. I mean, I would think that one of the things that we have to remember in content moderation is that cultural ingenuity always outpaces rule imposition. It just does. And when we're talking about content, which is language, which is creativity, like that's just always going to be true. it's not as if there isn't an answer to that. It's just messy. It's governance, right? So like, you know, how you hold a town hall, the tactics someone might use to disrupt that will change. And then you have to go like, well, we set a bunch of rules and the rules didn't cover this thing. So technically it wasn't disallowed. So now we have to be like, oh, you brought a Vuvuzela to the World Cup. Like, is that not okay? Now we have to have a rule against that, right? That's now contraband. The creativity that you're talking about is precisely what is the case about actual online communities, is making meaning shift over time. And the collision between communities that, you know, bring images into conflict, where Pepe the Frog isn't a problem for everyone who agrees, and that it really is a problem for those who are troubled by that community. Like that's I don't know that we'd want the world not to be that way. We're just you're right. Like that's why technical solutions, but even just rules, are always behind that process, right? Because the innovations that people are engaging, both to just be creative and especially to evade rules, are always going to be ahead of rulemaking.
I think this is also where approaches like constitutional AI are really interesting, for exactly reasons Paladin just said, that like, how do we sort of distill like the basic principles that we want things to follow? And then like the way those principles are applied will change based on context, based on time, based on the user. And but like, are there any principles that we actually do all agree on and will agree on long term?
And if we think this is anything like the courts, which I don't want to extend that metaphor, right? But we write principles and then we spend most of our time wondering what the principles meant, right? Which is good. Like that's not a bad thing. That's not a failure of the system. It can be. But that idea of like articulating principles that are not instance specific or topic specific makes sense, because that's a guide going forward. But then we go, well, what did this principle include this or not include this? And has the cultural norm around this principle changed? And who thinks so? And why did we reach that principle in the first place? Like that has to be an ongoing part of the deliberation. So the question is then, where does that deliberation happen? Is that supposed to be a team of 12 people at Facebook? Is that supposed to be the Facebook group? Is that supposed to be everyone? Is that supposed to be Congress? You know, that's a really wide open question.
Well, I think this is one like more interesting things I've learned digging in the constitutional AI piece is that like the founders kind of expected the Constitution to be like regularly amended and changed, and we kind of forgot about that. But there is, I think we probably want to have that kind of approach for Gen AI. But if we think about sort of like foundation model approach, like we are sort of going to be, you know, really, if it works, you know, putting some values sort of deeply embedded in these systems that might be difficult to update. And so how we sort of think about this in layers, I think will be quite interesting. But also how do we sort of, you know, have more public input in the actual design of them.
But then I also think that there's like an interesting thing here, which is principles matter for the model developers and the people who are thinking about these problems, but then how do they matter for the end users? Like, does it matter to an end user to know the principles behind whatever they're interacting with? Maybe it does, but will they actually in practice be seeking out that information? Or how should we be thinking about exposing that information more readily in whatever experience they're having? And how would that change behavior of like, do I choose this service or another service? Would it actually meaningfully change end user behavior? That's something I haven't fully thought about from the constitutional AI perspective, because I think it is something that like we are actively thinking about to try and make some of these decisions, but I don't know how much it matters or will matter to end users. Maybe it will.
And certainly the shift we've seen in social media is that platforms have had to think more about the principles they have for process, not just the principles they have for what is allowed and disallowed. Because maybe the model is not how do we get it right, but the model is how do we be okay getting it wrong and have that be just and fair. So the idea of like, how do you appeal an unfair decision? How do you petition to change a rule? How do you dispute the right to make that decision? Like there even could be principles for that, right? And it's ugly because we want, again, the kind of what I was saying, the kind of customer service model, like wouldn't it just be great if it worked and we got it all right ahead of time? But like you said, the Constitution, if we're using that metaphor, was meant to set a pattern for how those rules could be incomplete and what's supposed to happen when that's true. So how do you build principles for change, like the question in the room, how do you build principles for when the situation changes? How do you build principles when people feel wronged by a mechanism that is even built in their interest, right?
I think there's that kind of legitimacy challenge that's happening right now, where even as platforms became a little more transparent about the basic principles of policy, or the principles of enforcement, right? Laying out, remove, reduce, inform, and articulating what those different spheres meant. Because all of these decisions can impact profoundly powerful people, particularly because they can have they can confer very real world power, right? Particularly in the political realm. What we might call ref working really picked up with a vengeance in the 2018 midterms. And I think a little bit after, I believe that was the first time, no, I think 2020 was when Trump had his first tweet labeled. And the absolute firestorm that labeling was censorship, that labeling is counter speech, right? Labeling is contextualization. But because that narrative of censorship and opaque moderation had taken hold to such a profound extent because of various other things, kind of ref working and debates about who had been moderated fairly and who had not, and a lot of different communities felt that they had been moderated unfairly over the years, because with so many different decisions, particularly with automated decisions, there are inevitably going to be false positives and bad calls. But then each one of those becomes this kind of guiding light, this sort of North Star for the faction to delegitimize moderation entirely. And so I think one of the things that we've tried to advocate for at SIO over the years is more transparency in moderation, right? As far as there are the transparency reports, but they tend to kind of aggregate everything. They're not particularly useful. Google, I think, actually does this well. I will give Google a little bit of props for this, particularly from state actors. You can go and you can look at what a state actor requested be taken down, and you can see that quite transparently. Twitter, you used to be able to see it through things like the compliance API, but then they killed the compliance API for outside researchers, so now we can't, right? So in some ways, even though we should have a trend towards more transparency around how these decisions are made, which is kind of step one in analyzing whether they are, to what extent they are biased, or step two would be to enabling those kinds of appeals, we've actually kind of moved back in the other direction, where in many platforms, it's actually become significantly more opaque as platforms have begun to reduce the amount of data that they make available to researchers who study these questions. So there's a few different dynamics that are taking shape that are kind of the culmination of platforms not wanting to be political punching bags on one hand, while also trying to create a good environment for their users and their business on the other hand.
And I think these, I think from a transparency, I think yes, from the group they can moderate. I mean, I think if you think about that, the automated side from the models and everything, then I think it ties into maybe the explainable AI, right? The ability to really not just say, hey, this should be moderated, but it's like, hey, this is maybe the reasoning behind the decisions, right? Which is, I think it's a very important as we go forward, right? As well. I don't know if you have any comments specifically on how that ties on it, but yeah, I think I find it very important. Yeah. All right, we have about 5 more minutes. Any question from the room, on any topic for any other speakers?
I have one question.
Yeah, please.
How much of content moderation do you think is a problem because people can be anonymous? And the second part of the question is, how do you guys feel about the different approach that China is taking, where you cannot be anonymous on the web, and their concept of social credit to be able to trace back to the source of this information, or I guess for legal purposes and punishment?
It's too easy today in the internet. Yes, being anonymous to
right,
from to spread misinformation, all these kind of things. Yeah,
right. Because I would never. Some people say things on the web that they would never say in person, right? Yeah. So, and I think the China approach is basically that, where if you're no longer anonymous, you have less need for content moderation.
I think that's definitely in part true when it comes to harmful speech, for instance. But for something like disinformation, we've seen that WhatsApp groups are actually one of the primary ways that this is shared from people you really trust. So from your aunts and uncles, if any of you have large family WhatsApp groups, it's a staple of my family. And so I actually do think that the thing we need to be concerned about is those sort of how to sort of monitor effectively in these kind of private spaces where people are going to continue to retreat, particularly as the platforms become more politicized or just they become less interested in using and being public. And yeah, sure.
Also, anonymity is probably pretty tied to power. So just because you have identity doesn't mean you get rid of all the problems of content moderation, most likely. I haven't thought about the relationship between anonymity and content moderation too much, but I just say that even if you remove that, then probably what gets hyper focused on is like, who is this person? And like, do they have some legitimacy to say what they want to say or power to be able to say more than others might? And so then that starts to get in the mix.
I think there's also the challenge that these are global platforms, right? And you're not going to be able to gate that off. So even as within the United States, probably if anonymity were to disappear tomorrow, which I don't think is actually a good idea, but if it were, most people would probably not be afraid that the government would come and arrest them, right? But in other parts of the world, that very much is a risk. And so that unfortunately, because we're all on, we had these massive global networks, there are some abilities to regionalize, but it'd be very, very difficult to kind of do something as foundational as that. There's also a lot of very significant kind of privacy concerns, data security concerns. How do you validate? One of the interesting things, though, that became part of the conversation as the kind of generative text bot specter began to loom was this question of, could you have persistent pseudonymity, right? You don't necessarily need to be out there in true name saying the things that you want to say, but might there be some sort of persistence? And this was where with Reddit, again, you kind of have that, right? So you have your kind of little identity and you have your, your kind of cred score. And so someone can see that you didn't just like immediately create your account for the purpose of like, being a shitster in this one sub on this one thread in this minute. But you're also, you have kind of a persistent reputation that you'd like to potentially preserve across the entirety of the platform. And you want to continue to, to be able to speak. And so there are these potential ways of thinking about identity that are not necessarily tied to true name, but rather to some form of persistence. And I know some of the Web3 people were thinking about that. I'm sort of like, I kind of like sort of turn off as soon as I hear the blockchain, but I don't know if Tarleton has an opinion here.
Yeah, I was going to say that, if anonymity were the whole problem, Facebook would have no bad behavior on it whatsoever. But I think the thing that we suspect about anonymity is really the question about whether there is any social consequence, right? So being anonymous helps you avoid social consequence. And so that's why it can be part of harassment and just throwing porn into a discussion that, doesn't want it to be. And we hope that having a name attached is somehow going to grant social consequence, but it doesn't always, right? So being that circulator of bad information on a WhatsApp group or being on a network where you can speak to a community and then your post can start to circulate in a viral form or in a forwarded form, distances you from social consequence, the way that like being in a persistent group where people can shun you because you're like saying garbage all the time, that has a consequence. And I think one of the things that the major platforms have struggled with is that they've then been asked to impose consequence because other forms of consequence don't exist, because people circulate, because you can make another account, because you can do all these things, because pseudonyms don't persist. And then we go like, why is it you? And why do you do it this way? And why is it so profit driven and American centric and all that? These other ideas about how social consequence can carry, right? When we go to the law and say, non-consensual porn should be illegal, that's an attempt to build a system of consequence for a very particular kind of category. So these places where people are detached because they want to be or because they simply are by the design of the platform from social consequence opens up this concern. Anonymity is just one of those versions, but there's lots of ways that we get separated from social consequence. Even light social consequence, like, like in this room, it's gonna be like, Jesus, why are you talking like that? Like just a little bit has power, right?
Any other question?
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you see from this workshop, right, we have people from industry, at least some of the main players, and then we have people from academia. We try, and we probably should try harder for people from government. I was wondering that it's probably some kind of regulation or law may be coming, and in some other countries like in Europe, they already have these, right? How, I don't know if it's like your thoughts on something productive, because I would think there are shared values, right, from between government, industry, and academia, and there are also different priorities. And what can industry, academia do when well, knowing that regulation said maybe something will become a policy that will affect, right, at least industry.
Hard question you asked me.
I think as we start to see things like, I'll speak from the AI perspective, not necessarily from the platform perspective, though there are things like the Digital Services Act that start to think about platform data platform data sharing requirements with academic researchers, and thinking meaningfully about what that data could be used for and how to actually turn that data into useful recommendations for both the platforms and companies, but also the policymakers that are trying to make decisions around this is probably pretty important, because we see that as a trend, but how do we actually operationalize what it means to share data and then turn it into something that is then holding companies accountable? Then the second thing that I'll say is we're starting to see things like the EU AI Act, the NIST risk management framework for AI, and these are very much tied to the questions of auditing, but I think downstream content moderation and governance practices at organizations are implicated in all of that. And so I think that from an academic researcher's perspective, it would be really interesting to think, because I think a lot of these questions will boil down to who can study discrete pieces of the question of the problem really well. So how do we understand, for example, bias in AI models in the context of healthcare, in any other context like artwork, anything like that? How are we actually going to use data that's then shared with somebody who is going to be the actual auditor in this case? And I think academics might play a role in the auditing ecosystem going forward. And really it's just starting to look at those proposed frameworks and what would it mean to take one piece of that, design a research question to try and answer that, because the companies today, we're kind of thinking about how do we, even if we were to operationalize this framework, who is well suited to answer those questions? And I think it's probably, some of them are probably academics.
Thank you. I think we have one question in the chat. I don't know, Victor, if you want to raise your question.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, thanks. Really interesting workshop, by the way. So I was just wondering, what are the main challenges really in moderation? Is it diversity and probably an evolving community and the concept of freedom? And I don't know, the example for me that comes into play is if you have a uniform, non-evolving group, or that you somehow control, somehow is easy to moderate. No, it's an easy herd to guide. So just to know the opinion of the panelists and how to balance that while doing moderation.
I guess for me, I mean, it's hard to summarize this in sort of a, what is the one big challenge, but I do think it's, what are we imagining moderation supposed to do, right? So you put herd in quotation marks, which I think is right, because I'm not sure we're supposed to be herding, right? Or maybe there are some contexts in which that's what we should do and that's what we shouldn't. I think many of the disputes we've had over the last couple of years have been about what does it mean to make a space that is open to many kinds of participation, but that is also experienced by everyone as a fair and flourishing environment to speak. And that's an incredibly difficult challenge. We've never met that challenge in public spaces, in physical spaces. And now we've got online spaces that offer new techniques and opportunities to disrupt that. If we had a singular group of people with a singular purpose, then we can moderate. And Renee pointed out that like there are Reddit groups that moderate so that it's only cat photos and not dog photos, and that's sort of an agreement, right? It's not like dog photos are wrong; it's that this was a purposeful activity. But even there are disputes, right? Even in Wikipedia, when you're trying to design an encyclopedia entry and everyone kind of agrees on the charge, there's still disagreements about what that looks like in practice. Do you want to limit those disagreements to get to a result, or is having the disagreement itself part of the result? And I think that's a really hard question. And then when we start to shift to the sort of AI tools, then we have to think about like, what is the difference between providing a service and having someone create something for themselves, and then the fact that they could create something and put it out into the world? Like all three of those dimensions of the question are quite different. So to me, there are questions about collectivity, and that's both like communal collectivity, what is a group trying to do, and public collectivity, what is like useful and fair for the public. And these services, whether it's Facebook or OpenAI, are in a very particularly powerful position, as are many private information providers, that their choices matter a great deal for what kinds of publics you can create. So they are de facto governing the process by design, by policy. But that's been true about newspapers and TV networks, right? There's an immense power to shape how information circulates and how people participate. So what are the goals is the question, to which the answer is, what values are you trying to optimize for?
Thank you. I think we are like a little past time, but I think that was a very exciting discussion. I would like to thank the panels one more time. I think it's been thank you so much for joining us. I think that's a lot of the points that you talked about it, where the responsibility lies. I think that's actually how we started in the first place. I think we are all all the organizers here are working in the topic of moderation, and we got together. We said, okay, we are all individually, let's say, tackling this, but what about we create something at workshop to start spreading the awareness, start talking together. I think we all believe this to be a very important topic that is just bound to increase, right, with the ongoing efforts, and the new technology coming out. So thank you so much for joining us. I think that's been a great morning. So thank you. For everybody else, so we have lunch now. We'll regroup and start with the second round at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Very interesting discussion. Huh?
Thank you all. What should we do with this? Should I leave my laptop here, or is it good for me to leave the laptop here, or I should take with me?
Like here, like lunch break. I don't know. It's up to you. Is your laptop or your company laptop?
My company.
So you're gonna leave it on with sensitive information on? I would do it.
Probably not, right?
I mean, I think at least you should.
Yeah.
I wouldn't leave it locked in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just paused the recording, right?
So that which recording is running?
I think I just maybe I don't know what they did to it. I think she's showing my slide. Where is my Zoom meeting? Presenter. How do I get out of it? Stop sharing.
And slide.
And slide. Oh yeah, here. And then this doesn't matter anymore. And I should pop.